All right. Welcome to the Bad Boy of Science.
Right.
So I think we have all the stuff properly this time around. I'm going to check the sound on my end to see if it's coming through.
Yeah, hi everyone. We're just doing the initial pre-flight checks.
Okay, so it seems like he's a little bit low. So let me make adjustments to the sound. Okay, I'll go here and then I ramp this up a bit. Back. So that's probably a bit better. Thank you for that sub. Wow, another sub. Appreciate that. 7 months from Erila. All right.
That's a good strong start to the stream.
Yeah. So now we can go destroy the space pirates. What I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly turn off the alert bank, so that doesn't so we're not interrupted by those kinds of things.
That's cool. Do you want to share your screen with me so you've got the links we want to look at as well? Because as nice as it is, we've got you in a side box at the side and then a big version of you in the middle, which I'm not saying that's not nice or good, but we've got a lot of real estate.
Okay.
So
hold on. So okay. So what are you saying?
So if you share your screen with me,
okay.
I will get everything.
There's a lot of stuff.
Yeah. So you're gonna control the links. If you want to.
Okay.
If you want to.
We have a really cool image right now on the screen. So it's something we can talk about.
Yeah, fire it up if you can. Can you share your screen with me?
Yeah. So I do that by touching this, and then I go share screen. Right there.
And then I should get it, hopefully. Yeah, I've got it. Right. So, what we're going to start with? Do you want to start with Venus, or what do you want to start with?
If we're gonna do that, I need to.
Or do you want to start with SCOTUS?
I need to switch. Let's start with SCOTUS for a bit. So, as people may have heard, there's a vacancy in the Supreme Court now from the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Before we get into this, Jason, by the way, I should say, so obviously this is a really big story of the week.
Okay, hold on. It says trim his camera, cut out the mini can. What's the trim his camera? What's wrong with his camera?
Someone's getting some echo apparently as well. So,
are we getting echo? I don't know that I'm getting echo.
I've got echo on the stream. Let me see.
Okay, I see what they're talking about. They want me to cut out the logo on the minicam logo on your screen. So it's only going to be an even-bodied head.
Oh, that's fine. We're just doing the pre-flight checks here, Sean. I think it just means like we need to get into it, which is fair enough.
So about the Supreme Court. I'm in a position. My position on the Supreme Court is I wish that the whole process was less political than it is. There's a long history of wrangling about Supreme Court appointments that goes back many decades. That's conveniently forgotten by a lot of people when they voice their strident opinions about what should happen in people's nominations. Whether or not you like personally, I prefer. Now this is not. I'm not going to be speaking about political sides on this. I'm going to speak about judicial philosophy. The term is the same on both things. I prefer the conservative judicial philosophy. Because I think stronger enforcement of the separation of powers. One of the things I like about the United States Constitution is that it's geared around the separation of powers. That I don't know why my. Thank you for that follow. I don't know why the alert bank is still putting stuff. I'm gonna have to switch around real quick to make sure that all the alert banks are turned off.
So maybe if I pick this up for a little bit. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is a progressive justice, left-leaning justice, passed away this week. Obviously, when anyone dies, particularly someone who's been suffering with ill health, as she has been with pancreatic cancer for about 10 years, it's a very sad situation. She was a great advocate for progressive causes. She was a trailblazer for women in law, getting into high positions in law in the, I believe, 60s, 70s. So very well thought of. And now we've got, after her death, an awful lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth, because the idea is that Donald Trump is going to turn around and replace a progressive justice on the court with someone who's more conservative, textual conservative, someone who reads the Constitution in a more conservative way, as he did with Brett Kavanaugh, potentially, although he doesn't seem to be mega conservative. And there's talk of Amy Coney Barrett, who is a Catholic and a kind of staunch conservative. And then we've had all this wailing this week that essentially, all abortion rights are going to go away. There's going to be no laws against guns anywhere in the country, and that the Supreme Court is essentially going to become a rubber stamp for Republicans, which raises the question of what was it before. If you think the Supreme Court is turning conservative, that suggests that it's been very progressive for quite a long time. But moving on from that, I guess the idea that you sort of touched on there is, should the Republicans be doing this? Because this seems to be a normal function of when you have the Senate and the presidency, you roll out a justice, vote on it, and then put that justice in. That seems to be the standard procedure.
So a bit more history about this. Now, just so I can clarify my terms. When I say the conservative judicial philosophy, I don't mean like political conservatives. I mean it's a philosophy where the judge says, basically this is what the law states, and I am bound by what the law states. Yeah. So if someone does something that's immoral but is legal, then the conservative judicial philosophy is the one that says it's legal, and so I have to side on the side of the law.
So minimal interpretation of the law, kind of sticking with the text as written and what it sort of meant at the time that it was written, rather than doing what perhaps more progressive justices do, which is try to interpret what the framers of the Constitution or what the writers of an equality clause in 1960s would have meant in 2020. So, for example, updating an equality law to include, issues around trans rights, for example. So they'd sort of magically wave the wand and say, well, really, this is what the Constitution would have meant regarding this issue, even though it's not an issue that the framers or the founders of certain laws could have even thought about at the time, and they didn't speak in those terms.
So the reason my preference is for that style of judiciary because I admit that there are individuals who are shafted by it, but the reason that people get shafted by it is not because of the judgment, but rather because the laws that are written are unjust, and it's the legislative branch who is responsible for writing just laws. And those are the people who are elected. And so if there is a change in political will or a change in culture or something like that, that should be reflected in the legislature should then write laws that reflect the will of the people. And then the judiciary should by and large be bound to how things are written, provided that they adhere to constraints on government placed by the Constitution.
Well, it does seem strange that just the very idea of a quote-unquote progressive justice seems quite anathema because it essentially suggests that you're updating laws. There's 7 wise seers on the Supreme Court who essentially, this is what conservatives will complain about, who are legislating from the bench, right? They're taking up, as you're saying, that role that should be fulfilled by the legislature, which is people who are representing the people who were voted on by the people. But instead, you've got this sort of almost secondary legislature through the Supreme Court, which can then hand down rulings which I assume become federal law and therefore affect all of the states at the same time, which with the philosophy of checks and balances, that seems a little bit overpowered, if that's the correct term to use.
So let me give you the reason why even though they may not speak it, why a legislator would want that kind of judicial activism is the term thrown around. The reason the legislature would want to do that is because then the legislature isn't responsible for any hard decisions. Their career does not get put on the line. They can just refuse to vote on something or obfuscate or do whatever, so things don't change, and then voice their responsibility off of their shoulders on the shoulders of a different branch of the government. And in particular, I think it's a major failing of the legislature. I want the legislature to be the most powerful branch of the government. And a consequence. Part of it is that politicians want to stay in power. They don't want to necessarily face repercussions based upon the decisions that they have to make. And so what has happened is that the lawmaking, a large fraction of the lawmaking in the United States is being done through the executive and the judicial branches, which is exactly the opposite. And to some extent, this was a concern of the founding fathers. They were concerned that the legislature would be too powerful because the legislature can make changes to the Constitution, although it does have to go through the states in order for that to be implemented. The legislature can control the budget. They have ultimately the supreme authority is the legislature, which in a democratic society, that's kind of what you want. And the founding fathers, many of them were concerned that the legislature would be too powerful. But then what you have is that it's a house divided, so it weakens itself just given the party nature of politics. And what has happened over time is that more and more of the legislative responsibility, the crafting policy, is taking place in government bureaucracies that aren't beholden to the people. And so you'll get, I'm kind of making a case. I think that it's important to have subject matter experts. It'd be nice to have more subject matter experts actually in the legislature rather than in the executive branch. But I recognize that we live in a much more complicated society than we did 200 years ago. And so crafting policy that deals with how do you regulate the inclusion of certain food additives and this, that, and the other, right? It's not as trivial as, well, I'm not saying that society's ever really been trivial, but it's not as straightforward as you might think. And so it's important to have people who have some idea of what they're talking about when it comes to these things. So I'm not opposed to government bureaucracies that manage certain things. But the fact that there's very little legislative oversight on these things, driven because legislators would rather not make hard decisions that they have to face their voters or their constituents about, has made it so that the legislature is largely impotent in their primary responsibility of crafting law. And the excuse that's given is then, well, it's the executive branch that then writes the laws, and it's the judicial branch that then says that those are actually the laws at contentious, boundaries. I should point out that a lot of the Supreme Court, part of the reason why it's kind of always a split decision is the Supreme Court usually only adopts cases that are, if the case makes it to the Supreme Court that is just clearly wrong from the appellate court, from the Court of Appeals, then they'll adopt it and it'll be like a unanimous decision. On the other hand, if you run into a situation where it's a contentious issue, then when those ones get elevated to the Supreme Court, it's no surprise that they're really closely divided, that you get 5-4 decisions in those cases. I think that Roberts has kind of assumed the role of, and people often forget that, and this is no shade to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I thought she was certainly a pioneer, but she wasn't the first woman
Yes.
on the Supreme Court. That was Sandra Day O'Connor. And Sandra Day O'Connor adopted the role when she was in office of basically being the peace mediator on the bench, kind of bringing people together to come up with a consensus opinion. Whether it's right or wrong judicially, it was like the one that people could agree upon.
Yeah.
And I think I kind of see Chief Justice Roberts as taking over that role.
So almost sort of creating checks and balances within that structure of the Supreme Court.
Yeah. And I will say that the Supreme Court justices, if you watch the way that they treat each other, even though they may disagree, they are universally respectful of each other's opinions. I think that they value each other as colleagues, even if they disagree with each other politically. And I think that the last two late justices exemplify that more than almost anybody else, because they were the opposite ends of the judicial philosophy spectrum. But anyway, so for what it's worth, but they really got along. I mean, they did all sorts of things together, outside of.
So why do you think we've got into a situation where this week, of course, everything has become incredibly politicized. We've got an election that's coming up in a little over a month.
When it happened, I was like, what else could happen?
No, I know. This was like, I was like, the season finale of Trump was always going to be, Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies like 1 month before the election. Like you just couldn't have written it. Like it was almost like, it's the season finale of Trump /2020. It was always going to happen. Do you think that the sort of wailing and gnashing of teeth that has happened on the Democratic side is reasonable in two senses? One, if the court was to become ostensibly conservative or very conservative, would that give a possibility for conservatives to push back on abortion rights in certain states, to push back on gun rights in certain states?
You mean gun control?
Gun control, excuse me. Is that something that's likely to happen, or is that something they could do through the Supreme Court? Because what seems to happen, I've observed, is that people try to push these sort of test cases to the Supreme Court. So you remember the baker was it Todd Phillips? So a couple of gay men will go into his bakery. They'll get sent away, and they knew they were going to get sent away, and then the case gets elevated to the Supreme Court, and suddenly we're talking about, can somebody decide not to make a gay wedding cake in their bakery? If the court were to rule that, no, you can't do that, that's discriminatory, how does that decision feed back into law that then governs law at the state level? Does it make a lot of difference, or is it just on that very specific thing? Why are people so scared of these Supreme Court decisions, or so happy with them? What is their direct impact?
So, because the stakes do go up when one of the branches of government is as dysfunctional as it is.
Yeah. So you think the reason it's got such focus is because the legislature is being so weak in passing things, and therefore the Supreme Court has become more of a legislature? Do you think that's why such a focus has become?
So I think that's part of it. And the other thing is, I think that the Supreme Court then becomes kind of the strong arm, where it's almost like if we're losing the argument, if we can't get our arguments through the legislature, then we're just going to rely on the courts to solve the problem for it. It's like mommy, right?
Yeah.
We're going to turn to the courts because they're mommy, and they're going to side with me. I was speaking with someone yesterday that they're like, once their particular political party is in all three branches of government, then the world will be better. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. It's like if you can only return to there's a thing from Reason magazine, which is a libertarian thing, and I really liked the note that they said. There was a quote from a former presidential candidate that said, once we're in power, then we can talk about returning, like being civil.
Yeah. And
this editor, Nick Gillespie's his name, his response was, if you can only be civil when your party's in power, then you're doing it wrong. And so I think that relatively little would change. one thing that happens is that once people get into kind of bubbles, ideological bubbles, they tend to overlook one is no one ever gets the real details of the decision and why the decision was made on any decision. It's like, what's the headline? That's good enough for me, and now I can either be upset or happy. And like they're like in terms of like the real underlying, like what are the nuts and bolts that drove the decision, and what are the ramifications that you would get if you were either hearing the arguments or making the arguments deliberating amongst yourself and your clerks. Then
so you think a lot of it is just we've got such overt politicization at the moment. People see that someone who skewed progressive on certain issues has died, and Trump is going to decide who goes as a nomination. So it's immediately bad because it's Trump. Is that a big part of the wailing and gnashing of teeth?
That's part of it, and also, look, people have traded religion for politics, and so they've gone bonkers. People go bonkers when it comes to these kinds of things. And they have short memories. So let me give you a bit of history about what the current situation is right now. So the claim or the main concern that people are running into is that Trump's going to nominate someone, the Republicans are going to ram it through. And that, the Republicans are being hypocritical, as though if the parties were reversed, then the hypocrisy would all of a sudden disappear, which is a complete fabrication. I mean, if anyone thinks that if there was a Democratic president and a Democratic Senate, and it was this close to the election, then the Democrat would be like, oh, we're not going to put someone on there. That would happen is delusional.
This is a really interesting.
Yourself, and not only are you deluding yourself, but then there are those who would say, yeah, but we're right. And
people always put themselves in the center, right? So yeah, that's just normal.
But my side, really cares about people, and therefore, it's okay for us to act this way, and when it's not okay for them because they're the devil incarnate.
Exactly.
It's pretty silly.
Well, I was gonna raise that point actually, because you make an interesting point, and I had thought naively, and probably because I listened to the certain press too much, or have taken a little bit too much on faith, that the Republicans rushing to put in a justice now was very hypocritical because of the way they treated Merrick Garland in 2016. So the idea put around ostensibly was that Mitch McConnell, who was the Senate Majority Leader, said that we're not going to put in Merrick Garland because it's the last year of the Obama presidency, and therefore the public should get to decide, and all this sort of stuff. And then we get to this situation now, and obviously he's flipped on that, and he's saying, no, we need to get justice through as soon as possible. But in actual fact, when you dig into it, you're not comparing apples with apples, because back in 2016, the Senate was with the Republicans, but the presidency was with the Democrats. So Obama was in power, but the Senate was with the Republicans. Whereas now the case is that the presidency and the Senate are with the Republicans. So you're not comparing apples with apples. And if you look at the history, as you say, it looks like that, around 80% plus of the time, when you have the Senate and the presidency, the justice gets confirmed. And when you have a mix where you don't have both, 80% of the time, the justice doesn't get confirmed. So the actual historical trend, if you were going to be a betting man, it's that really we should be putting a justice in now. It's only with a very sort of presentist, looking at the last couple of years, thinking Trump has destroyed all decency view, that you think, oh, they shouldn't be putting in a justice. And probably Mitch McConnell back in 2016 shouldn't have tried to be so hand wavy and cute, and should have said, look, we have the Senate, so tough you're not getting it, because the checks and balances within the American system are such that was the Senate's role, was to vote on and confirm or not confirm a justice. And as you say, it seems in the current climate that if the roles were reversed, then I don't think the Democrats would have been confirming Brett Kavanaugh. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and I don't think anyone who thinks otherwise is delusional. And so have little ground to stand on. Now, okay, let me give you my opinion, and then I'll go back to give even more historical context for this. So my opinion is it's the role of the president. It's the job of the president to nominate people to the Supreme Court. It's the job of the Senate to confirm the the candidates for the Supreme
this
Court.
is their enumerated powers, right? This is what they should be doing. So to your mind, should the president this week be nominating a justice, and should the Senate be giving it a vote before the election?
Yes, and I think had Scalia died, was it Scalia?
Yes, Antonin Scalia.
The one that retired, was it Kennedy that? It was the one that retired.
Yeah.
At the end of the Obama presidency. Had that happened the day before the election, I think that Obama should have nominated someone. Had it happened the day before the inauguration, Obama was completely within his power to nominate someone to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
The president should nominate whenever. It doesn't matter who the president is. And then there's stuff about but this president's been impeached, and it's like, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that is, I think, largely irrelevant, and would, if someone actually thought through what they were saying when they said, but this president's been impeached, therefore we shouldn't do it, then what's going to happen is every president's going to get impeached.
Yeah.
And the only time that doesn't happen, the only time that a president doesn't get impeached, thank you for that follow, the only time that the president doesn't get impeached is when all three branches of government are under the same party.
Yeah.
And is that when you want to pick your justices, is when all three branches of government are operating under the same party?
Yeah.
So the president comes in, he's not impeached, and so he can nominate Supreme Court justice, so the House is with him, he's not impeached, and the Senate is with him, so the justices get confirmed. That's what you want? And some people will be like, yeah, because, my party's the righteous one.
Yeah.
It's like, you are a fool if you think that. And so the adversarial stuff,
yeah, it's built into the system purposefully.
Right, but so now what happened was, back in the day, it used to be that in order to confirm a judge, and it wasn't just a Supreme Court justice, it was any judge, that you needed a 60% majority in the Senate, which means that in almost any circumstance, because the Senate is always going to be right near 50%, the parties are smart enough to know how to grow their constituencies so that they basically maintain a 50, maybe it's, if it ever got to 45-55, it'd be like, holy cow, I can't believe the Senate is so far out of balance. And so the Senate is always going to be floating around 50% one way or the other. And so it used to be a 60% was required, which required bipartisan support for all the nominations. And what would happen is that in those kinds of votes, you would have filibusters where the minority party would come in and they would say, they would read the phone book. There are things where they literally read the phone book. They get it out and like Abernathy and read the numbers and stuff like that, just to take up time on the Senate floor, because you're supposed to be able to deliberate something for as long as you want, or as long as both parties want, and then you bring it to a vote. And so if you filibuster, you just occupy the stage and no one can take their place, and the vote can't happen, and then you go into recess anyway. So there's all these rules in the Senate that are agreed upon by the senators. So the Senate votes on what their rules of operations are. So the filibuster has a long and glorious history in the United States Senate. And what was happening is that when the Tea Party came in, so Republicans were like, well, a branch of the Republican Party, or a constituency of the Republican Party, was like, the Washington is out of whack, and they came to power in the Obama administration, there were a lot of them came in like 2010. I think it was a little bit later. So they come in, which was a kind of a demonstration that the will of the people was. So what often happens is that when there's an election and something switches sides, you get like 50.001% of the vote, and now all of a sudden you have a mandate. Like, oh, now we have the mandate to do this. It's like, no, the country is still, still hates you. Your approval rating, congressional approval rating is still, at 30%. And so, it's not that like, wow, all of a sudden, we've won a bunch of seats by a grand total of 10 votes. And now, we're the ones who have clearly the moral authority to start dictating policy. That's not that's not how I read it. What I read it is people are sick of it. And so it's been flipping back and forth.
Yeah.
For about 40 years, the Democrats controlled both the Senate and the House.
Yeah.
So they, like, from the 60s through the 80s, they controlled everything. And it wasn't until the 90s that it was this huge like piece of news when the House switched to Republicans in the early 90s, 94. And so, and since then, it's actually flopped back and forth several times, where it was a half a century of basically stability in terms of who was in the majority power. And that has been misinterpreted by the political parties as a new mandate every time the thing switches, when the reality is that nobody's happy with anybody, and anything that's a change is better than what we currently have.
Yeah.
And so, anyways, the Republicans came in the middle of the Obama administration. A new wave of Republicans came in the middle of the Obama administration, and they started holding things up. They're like, look, we don't agree with these judges and stuff like that. And so they were using all the tools that they could to, caterwaul about, how much they disagree with the appointments that were being made. And so the Senator Harry Reid was the majority leader in the Senate. And he said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to then change the rules of the Senate and get rid of the filibuster so that you can't block judicial nominations by having 41% of the legislature, all Republicans, or of the Senate, all Republicans, holding up the judicial nominations. So he has the ability to say, we're going to change the rules of the Senate and propose that rule change. And the rules of the Senate are dictated by majority, not a supermajority. And he had 51 votes. And so he's like, we're going to change the rules of the Senate. That was the nuclear option. We're going to change the rules of the Senate so that now judicial appointments only need a bare majority and not a supermajority to be appointed. And so that change happened, where then it was, okay, whichever party's in power, they basically run the whole show. There's no need for bipartisanship anymore. Yeah. And that was under Harry Reid, the Democrat. Yeah.
So now the club that they created is now in the hands of the Republicans, and now they don't like it.
And Mitch McConnell said that was it 2013? Yeah. He said that. He's like,
it's all fun when you've got this, it's no more fun when the rabbit's got the gun, sort of thing. Yeah.
He said, you'll regret this sooner than you think.
Yeah.
That's exactly what happened. And McConnell's argument, to kind of steelman his argument, which he's made, so I don't necessarily need to steelman it, but people don't want to listen to their political adversaries. The argument that he made was that in the midterm election before Obama went out, so Harry Reid was this majority leader in the Senate. Obama was president in 2012, so when Obama was elected for a second term. In 2014, the Senate switched party leadership. So the more Republicans came into the Senate, and McConnell says this is a sign, or like his argument is, this is a sign that the American people disagree with the current agenda and they want some check on the authority of the executive branch. And they manifest that desire by electing more Republican senators to the legislature. And therefore, that's what I've been told by the electorate. And so that means that I need to push back harder on judicial nominations. And if that's the political wins, then I'm not going to vote on Merrick Garland. Personally, I think that Obama was completely within his rights. I guess technically Obama was completely within his rights to propose Merrick Garland, and Mitch McConnell was completely within his rights not to hear it. Yeah. However, I would have preferred that he just heard it. Like, here's the person, let's adjudicate, judge this person and pass it through. And it should have gone through with 89 senators or 95 senators or whatever. That's my opinion, and my opinion has not changed. Yeah. So the president should do this thing, and there's no, I'm not going to change how I think things should operate simply because it's different political parties that are in power. And so a lot of the stuff, the last major time when this same situation arose, where there was someone from one political party in power and the Senate was controlled by the opposite political party, and it was close to the end of the thing. So before Garland, the one that happened before that, it was President George H.W. Bush, George Sr., was president, and the Senate Judiciary Committee chair who refused to do this was none other than Joe Biden. And so these people have been in power for decades. They know each other. They've been there for decades. And so all the 30 somethings that are like, have only had 6 years of like exposure to politics. They're like, oh, these people are so evil. It's like, all they're doing is like, hey, I remember when you did this to us, we're going to do it back to you. It's like there's zero like historical perspective on any of this kind of stuff. And I think it's silly.
It's all very presentist. How do you think, maybe if we close this one off, because we talked about it for a while now, how do you think this plays politically with regards to the election? So it looks like Trump's going to nominate this week, probably going to be someone out of Amy Coney Barrett or was it Barbara Lagoa, the Cuban American lady of Cuban extraction.
So I one real quick thing.
Sure.
I believe that the person who was proposed by George H.W. Bush when Biden was there, would have been the first Hispanic on the Supreme Court. So, like all the like diversity garbage that like, oh, but it's like only it's hogwash. It's total hogwash.
Well, there was talk of potentially he might nominate Lagoa because it will play well in Florida, which is of course a very important state for the election. She's a lady of Hispanic extraction, which he loves a good troll against the Democrats, like you say, with all the diversity agenda. So probably going to be one of those two, Lagoa or Coney Barrett. How do you think this plays in the election? Because I think it muddies it. I think it muddies it a bit because I think there are people who were kind of switching allegiances in order to vote for Trump because of the rioting and stuff like that. Yes.
And
are people now going to look at that and say, oh, actually, he this is a problem, and I'm worried about my abortion rights, I'm worried about gun control laws and stuff, and the Supreme Court might impact on that.
I think that there will be people who then have become increasingly undecided as a consequence.
Yeah.
I think if they're willing to switch once, they're willing to switch twice to some extent. Because once you start needing to defend someone, then you kind of become their advocate.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I despise the national media. Local media generally does a good job because they're in the communities that they're reporting on, but national media has no allegiances to anybody. And I have zero respect. There are very, 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 very few people on the national stage that I respect as journalists.
Yeah.
And because they've got nothing to lose by stirring up, generating more news for their programs.
So do you think do you think this plays in Trump's favor, rushing through a justice, or do you think it plays against his favor in terms of the election?
So I think that it really, for people who have been thinking a lot, kind of mulling over this thing, it may kind of solidify. It puts them a little bit back on their own base. I think it will tend to drive people a bit more towards their own natural proclivities when it comes to these things. And so if you have someone that's kind of on the fence, like, this rioting is terrible, and so I'm gonna vote for Trump because that's the issue that is kind of dominating things, that this might say, but actually I don't want the Supreme Court to look like this, and so it's going to kind of drive people on the fringe, I suspect, back towards who they would naturally vote for.
Because there was some talk of he could have held it up through the election as a kind of another driver to get people out to the polls. Get out, vote for Trump, and you also get a Supreme Court pick.
I don't think that would change things.
No.
I think that if you nominate someone or not, I don't think that will change the dynamic that's at play. I think that the fact that it happened at all is what changes the dynamic, and whether he nominates someone before or after the election, I don't think makes any difference. I think it's the job of the president has the authority to nominate anybody, and no president, I can't imagine any president ever not taking advantage of that opportunity. And so all the people that think, if Donald Trump were just a different person, then I would like him. It's like, on what planet do you live on?
No, it's all power politics between the parties. What do you make of the sort of the democratic reaction in terms of the politicians, not people, screaming on social media and what have you, of saying essentially, if you do this, we're going to burn the system down. So we're going to add a load of justices to the Supreme Court. It's going to be 15. We're going to pack it with Democrats or progressive justices. We're going to add states to the Senate, sort of. I think Puerto Rico and where was it, Guam or somewhere was mentioned, adding these to the Senate, and they have Democratic senators. What did you make of those comments? Because it seemed very much like, I'm not getting my way, and it seemed like the Republicans are just
throw a temper tantrum.
The Republicans are doing what is in the enumerated powers of the Senate and the presidency, the executive. So you might not like what they're doing, but they are acting within the powers.
Yeah.
And then the Democrats are like, well, we're just going to burn it all down. Are they still acting within the powers, or are they being petulant there?
I think in that regard, they are being petulant. And the members of Congress, I don't know that there are many members of Congress who are actually like, we're going to burn the thing down. And they're probably from the House. And
is it all for show before the election?
Part of it's for show. Part of it is because the unfortunate situation we live in today with the benefits of modern communication, that the every district is actually a national district now, which is unfortunate, where there are certain districts where 95% of the funding comes from outside of the district for the political campaigns, which is a clear demonstration that a lot of people who are not everybody, but a lot of people who are elected to Congress are elected because of a congregation of political will that is spread outside of their district, focusing their attention on that one district.
Yeah.
And so that, I think, is unfortunate. I don't know if there's much that can be done about it. Like if I have a cousin who's running for office in some place, I think I should be able to, donate money to him. And so, I don't know that anything's going to change about that. But a consequence of that is that some political races, especially Senate races, but also some in the House, become national races rather than local races.
Yeah.
And so to the extent that all the districts can be swing districts, then you don't run into that problem. So if the districts are better aligned demographically with a cross section of the society that they represent, of the boundaries of their districts are a better cross section of the society, where the local society, then that issue doesn't arise anymore, because they won't be as beholden to outside forces, to outside money. So I think there's some grandstanding that's going on there. It's a terrible idea. There are some news media people who are like, burn it all down, because they're all idiots.
Well, all the late night hosts jump on it because they try to be funny in inverted commas, because they're very rarely funny from what I can see, and just sort of political hacks.
That's something that really bothers me. Like, I'll talk to my colleagues in private about, hey, there's this issue that came up, and I want to talk to someone about it, or like, say, do you want to talk about this? And they'll say things, and they'll say, do you have a source for that claim? And then they send me like Stephen Colbert, and I'm like, why are you sending me this?
I love it when somebody sends me like a Trevor Noah, or who's the English bloke we sent you?
John
Oliver. And I'm just like, are you seriously sending me this? Like, the guys are comedian, so like, I don't think they're very well read on these topics, and B, like, their audience skews a particular way, so of course they have a vested interest to lean that way and spew certain talking points. So if this is your source, I think we can do a little bit better than a Trevor Noah clip on the Constitution.
To go a step further than that is that the same people will be like, I don't like the fact that the students are acting this way. Like, some student groups are acting the fool on campus, even though I kind of support their ideas. It's like, those are the people writing the jokes. Yeah. It's not the mechanical engineering student that's writing the jokes for Stephen Colbert, right? It's the underwater basket weaving studies major. And so
there's definitely a misalignment between news, comedy as well, where these things have now become in the modern era something where you need to drive clicks, you need to drive likes, you need to drive views.
Yeah.
And getting as objective truth out there on a matter as you can. Obviously, you're never going to be completely objective. There's social aspects that come in, but trying to get as good journalism out there as possible seems to have fallen away to stroking confirmation bias gets you more clicks and more likes and gets people wound up. And there's a mismatch between, this has been discussed a lot. This is not something new that I'm saying, but there's a mismatch between those two goals of high quality journalism and getting people fired up and coming to your website. I think until people start putting a premium on
truth.
Yeah, on truth and
objectivity.
And it's difficult, right? Because as humans, we all do this motivated reasoning. We all want to go to a website and it immediately spews back, yeah, you're right. You were always right. Like, no worries. That's that. That you like that when you go somewhere and they're like, yeah, you worked it out, everything's fine, you don't need to change anything. When you go somewhere and you're challenged, it's more difficult, right? But you've got to. I've learned to kind of enjoy that because I've learned something new. Maybe it's the physics training, maybe it's the science training that when I learn something new or I learn that I was wrong, there's a value and a pleasure there because something has fallen away that was false. Mm-hmm. And in its place is something that's closer to the truth.
In those kinds of discussions, it's when it comes down to it's best to kind of establish what are the general goals that we want to accomplish.
Yeah.
Because, for example, in science, you can say, these are the data that we have. We want to come up with a physical model that describes these data. And then the deliberations you have are all with a recognition that the goal is to describe the data.
Yeah.
And then you can have good faith arguments.
Yeah.
But in too many cases, which is the overwhelming majority, I think, it's the majority of things that make the national media, you don't hear about the 435 to 0 votes on different policies, right? You only hear about the ones that are contentious.
Yeah.
Because, passing the recertification of the Americans are the greatest people on the planet, statement is not going to make the news. What has often happened is that people have decided that their party is right, and so it doesn't matter what the other people say.
Yeah.
And so it becomes an issue of like whose baseball team am I cheering for, rather than what issue are they addressing and what policies are they bringing up, like what solutions are they bringing up to address that issue, and are they arguing in good faith towards those things, or are they allowing their policies to be dictated by their political affiliation? And that's true with what, in my opinion, the writing on the Green New Deal is basically, I don't know what I'm talking about, and so I'm going to let my political party do all my talking for me.
Yeah.
Or my political ideology do all my talking for me.
This is my problem with most things at the moment. If we're talking about diversity and inclusion, if we're talking about the riots that are going on, if we're talking about whatever it might be, all I want to hear is what is the problem you've identified and what is the policy that you suggest for rectifying that problem. And then we can have a sensible discussion about whether we should put that in place or not. I think at the moment we spend so much time trying to create this overarching narrative and the huge monster that's out there that weaves all of this together.
We're storming the beaches of Normandy in our...
I just don't see the value. For example, I hear a lot of people talking about institutional racism, for example, comes up a lot. It's a buzzword term at the moment. Really, I just want to hear, what is the problem that you see, an individual problem, then another problem, then another problem, and your solution for each of them. I don't need to know about the narrative that happened 50 years ago, or particularly how we got to here. Maybe that will be useful towards the solutions. Most of the time it's not. I want to know what the problem is and how we're going to solve it. And then we can have a sensible, good faith discussion about, because I think most people of good faith are interested in the solutions. I'm not interested in the overarching, this is what's happened and this is why you're a bad person and this is why you should be involved with this ideology going forward. I want to know what you're suggesting, what the impacts will be, pro and against, the pros and cons of it, and then let's talk. I think there's far too much time is spent, as you say, saying you need to come over to this ideology or this ideology, whereas I want to look at an issue on its merits, one issue at a time. And there's too much of this come into my tribe before we can have that discussion.
Well, and don't you want to have the discussion of people like picking something apart?
Yeah, of course. It's fun, right? For a scientist.
Like, one, you can get more interesting discussions, and two is you can streamline things.
Well, yes, this is what I see at the moment is the discussion sort of goes off into the weeds about like definitions or, what do you mean by institutional racism? Whereas if you talk about something specifically, like, there's not enough childcare for women in science or whatever it might be, you can get a focused discussion as to why that might be a problem and what we might want to do about it. Whereas when you talk in these grandiose, wider terms and ideological terms, everyone just runs off into the weeds and starts screaming at each other about whether those, highfalutin ideals are right or wrong. I just think it wastes so much time and causes so much aggravation.
Yeah, so let me clarify my statement. I should say that it would normally streamline the results that you get in terms of like you could, in principle, in scientific experiments, you would tend to shed unnecessary things. Like if you're building an experiment and someone says, we don't really need this, we can actually do this other thing, then it can simplify things and streamline it. What generally happens in negotiations, because people are representing, politics is, especially in the House, is still a local issue, even though it's still mostly local, even though the outside influences are gaining kind of an increasing foothold, ever increasing foothold, as the stakes go up because of the regulatory state. But what ends up happening is that in order to get something through, everyone piles on what they want. What they'll do, here's how you can buy my vote by sending some project to, it's pork, like send something my way, send money to my district so that I can do this other project and I'll vote for you.
Yeah.
And so it actually kind of balloons up. It's similar to like what happens when you're writing a big paper with a lot of authors, and then you work on it, and then right at the end, all the people who weren't there for all the hard stuff show up and are like, oh, we need to do all these things. It's like, oh my gosh, the paper that was good and now it sucks. It's like it was written by committee at the end. So that is one issue. The adversarial stuff, like I had a discussion with someone who is about as far away from me politically as you can get on a college campus, and our discussion was about healthcare, and this person trusts me enough to say, like, I believe that you actually do want to help people.
Yeah.
And so the discussion we had wasn't one of an existing antagonism or an existing distrust on the motives of the person who was there.
Yeah.
But most of that kind of stuff, most of that kind of legislation happens from people that you never hear about. Yeah. The small scale, like we're going to make small adjustments, not like grand designs. Oh, we're going to have this grand, we're going to reform all things in the country all at once. Those always fail. I've never seen one of those succeed. I've never seen we're going to solve the entire immigration problem all at once. I've never seen something like that succeed. But in terms of we're going to make a small adjustment to this thing, a good example just happened where there was about childcare and how two people, one was a Republican, one was a Democrat, and they in the House, and they said there's a real issue with the most important and most expensive part of a person's life for the parent is usually the first couple years. So like the first 2 years of their life is when all the expenses all of a sudden balloon.
Yeah.
And so what they said was, okay, so instead of getting new taxes, if we put some constraints on ourselves, like no new taxes, no new money, what do we do? And so the solution they came up with was, in the United States, you get a tax credit for every child you have. So if you have a child, you get like $2,500 or $3,000 per year tax credit. And so what they said was, okay, so instead of having that all the time, you front load it. So you say the first year that you have a child, you're going to get this much money, and it's significantly more. And then in the subsequent years, the amount that you get is going to decline.
Yeah.
So it's the same total amount, but it's loaded towards the most expensive year. The first year when you're getting immunizations, and there's a whole bunch of doctor visits, and you have to go through 15 sets of clothing because the kids like, and every time you buy something, it's already too small by the time you get them home. And so that it did show up in the State of the Union address, and it was an instance where there was all the Republicans were clapping and one Democrat was clapping because she was the one who was working on that with the Republicans. And so, but nobody knows about it because, like, who cares about this stuff unless it actually affects you? But that's an example of, demonstrates that the stuff that where things really get done in terms of like improving things usually happens well below the leadership level. And the leadership is basically there to advocate for their political party, not to advocate for the American people. And I think that's true across the board. I have very little confidence that the party leadership, both for the political parties themselves and the party leadership within the houses of Congress, I think to first order in their minds, and I can understand where it comes from, their position is my party is the most important thing. And all of the real work to make improvements happens further down the food chain.
Makes sense. So, anyway. Did you have something else to say?
No, not on that, I think.
So I was going to say we've been talking about that for a while in the politics now. Maybe switch up the gears and go into a bit of science because, people are waiting for that as well. Maybe if we talk about this finding from Venus. So I've put up a nice little poll as well on stream so people can vote. Do you think there is life in the clouds of Venus? And Jason is an astronomer at the University of Las Vegas, Nevada.
Yeah.
So he's a good person to have on to discuss this with as well. And I had a chat at the weekend with Sarah Seeger, who's a professor at she's a professor at MIT who was looking at this as well. So we've got essentially, if you bring up, you've got the
link. Which one are you looking at?
Well, you're in charge, so that's coming up on my screen, so that's perfectly fine.
I don't know which one to select.
That's fine. I think I sent you a nice one on Gmail, but any one of them is fine. So
space.com, we'll do that one.
Yeah, exactly. Space.com is fine. So,
or I could just bring up the Nature paper. Can I do that?
You can bring up the Nature paper. So I'll sort of preface it for people, I guess. So last week, a paper came out where there was a finding of the chemical phosphine, which is a phosphorus with 3 hydrogen atoms attached. And this was a signal of phosphine was found in the clouds of Venus by the ALMA telescope and the James Clerk Maxwell telescope. And phosphine is only associated on the Earth with anaerobic environments of life. So produced by bacteria in swamps and, wetlands and places like this.
So it smells good, you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, smelly places, essentially. Yeah, animal guts and things like this. This is what Professor Seeger mentioned. Animal guts. We produce it. It probably comes out, doesn't smell too good. It's actually the chemical that gives you these will-o'-the-wisps, I think you call them, on swamps. So sometimes they can catch fire, and you see these ghost lights in the swamp, and it's a mixture of methane and phosphine.
So like the fire swamp from.
Exactly, or the dead marshes from Lord of the Rings, right? So it's this kind of thing. So associated with anaerobic environments, bacteria digesting things in anaerobic environments. So you wouldn't expect to see this chemical on Venus. You'd expect it to be phosphorus with some oxygen, or because there's not a lot of hydrogen on Venus, because obviously the temperature is very high, hydrogen's very light. It should have been stripped off and thrown out into space. So it's very strange to see a phosphorus with 3 hydrogens, and it suggested, therefore, that this could be a chemical signature of biology. There's essentially bacteria in the clouds of Venus that are producing this phosphine. So should probably say at the moment they found phosphine, but the scientific stance is they don't know where it's from. Mm-hmm. But the only way we know how to produce it on the Earth is from these anaerobic environments, and therefore people are excited that this could be a sign of life on Venus. But it is interesting in and of itself, because either it's a sign of life on Venus, in the clouds of Venus, or it's new chemistry that we don't understand about the clouds of Venus. So
it's exactly the kind of observation that you want. Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
There's no way to really grapple with it with current knowledge.
Yeah. So regardless, you found something new. Obviously, people want it to be life from an excitement perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But regardless, it will be new chemistry. So I don't know how you felt about that finding.
I was pretty interested in it. Later today, we're convening a meeting with our department in geoscience and a bunch of people from the life sciences to talk about, kind of what the findings were and what that implies. So that will be kind of interesting. I think it is really interesting that there's even that there's new chemistry alone is pretty interesting, because Venus for a long time, Venus was one of those forgotten worlds because there's been so much emphasis over the last, since 90s, so 25 years. All the emphasis has basically been on Mars.
Yeah.
Mars and then the outer planets. So Mars and Jupiter with Galileo, then Mars and Saturn with Cassini, and now Mars and Jupiter again with Juno.
I was discussing this with Professor Seeger, actually, because I was saying that Venus, the only people...
Well, I haven't spoken to her for a few years.
Oh, no, she's very well. So I was discussing it with her, and we were saying that the only people who visited Venus are the Russians, who sent these Venera spacecrafts in, I think, the mid-70s. And they only lasted for 50 minutes because obviously they short circuit in the sulfuric acid, or the electronics melt because it's such a hot planet. And it seemed to be, I don't know if you have an idea of why this might be, but it seemed that the Russians went towards Venus and the Americans went towards, or at least nowadays have gone towards Mars, Europa. Is there a political angle there, or is this just funding being spent on places that are most likely to give signals of life? So when we think about Mars, we think about Europa. People are talking about water below the surface, or a past that was likely very like the Earth in the case of Mars. Why are we seeing so much focus on Mars and Europa and not so much on Venus? Even though Carl Sagan was suggesting you might have, life in the clouds of Venus back in the 60s, 70s.
I think that Mars, after the Viking landers, Mars became a place where you kind of knew you'd have success. I think that's the main thing.
What was the success of the Viking landers? Why was that? Why did that become the case?
Because they landed, they survived for quite a while. They did a whole bunch of, there was a lot of stuff that they learned from the Viking landers.
Yeah.
And so there was little risk to going back to Mars. And it gave you the ability to develop a whole bunch of technologies, because they were like, okay, let's put a little remote control car that's this big on Mars, and that worked. Okay, now let's put one on that's this big on Mars, and that one worked, and then this big on Mars. And so now you got a little Fiat driving around on the surface, or will. Yeah. And so there was a lot more kind of incremental technology advancements that you could do on Mars. And it was, thank you for that follow. And so it was kind of a safer bet.
Yeah.
So I think that that's probably why Mars was the focus. It seemed to be working, and so they kind of were playing to the strength. Where sending something to Venus, who knows? I think the risk was high and the reward was presumed to be low.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of why the Russians went to Venus and the Americans went to Mars early on, some of it was Cold War things, but it's Cold War in a scientifically, the Cold War was a different animal. In fact, my understanding is that after, towards the end of the Cold War in the 80s and 90s, that the respective governments relied on the collegiality of the scientists to help facilitate some of the peace negotiations and with the ballistic missile treaties, and also just kind of the rapprochement of bringing the countries towards at least friendly terms instead of adversarial terms, because they knew that there was, lo and behold, if you have kind of this larger thing that you're working towards that kind of unify you,
it kind of binds the two sides together.
Yeah, that you can negotiate in better faith. Who would have thought? But and so there's always been kind of a like, we'll have this country will focus on this thing and these other ones will do this, kind of based on who the strengths are and how to just divide the limited resources that are available to do that. So then there was a joke. I need to come up with so we'll go with Elbonians because it's a joke against, different nationalities that you used to tell in the 1980s all the time. And so the French would tell it about the Belge, and the Belge would probably tell it about, I don't know.
Is it still acceptable for today's media, or is it going to get you cancelled in today's?
It's acceptable, but but I have a colleague who's from the country that Americans always so we need to go with Elbonians instead of the country that we would always make jokes about. Right. So the joke was that there's this big scientific summit, and the person from the United States was like, we're going to go to the moon and we're going to put more satellites around Mars, and everyone cheers like, yeah, it's going to be great. And then the Russians stand up, because this was the middle of the Cold War, so it was always the Americans and the Russians, and then the Elbonians. And then the Russians stood up and said, we're going to go to Venus and we're going to put more satellites around the Earth. And everyone's like, yeah, this is going to be wonderful. And then the Elbonian stands up and says, we're going to go to the sun. And everyone's like, boo, why are you doing that? And they said, don't worry, we got it all figured out. We're going to go at night.
Yeah. The old dad jokes are the best.
So anyways, that was the nature, the tenor of the environment at the time. And so the Russians going there, they saw their thing. There's hardly any reason to suspect that there's water on the surface. So, there's probably a limit to both what you can actually do with a surface craft and what you might expect to get out of a surface craft, even though the cost is essentially the same to send something to Venus as it is to send it to Mars. And so they just said, what's the cost benefit analysis? And so Mars became the focus. I think this really changes the dynamics of the NASA planetary science, where, they always toy around with, like, if we wanted to do a mission to Miranda, how would we do it? And
Professor Seeger was saying that there's four Discovery class missions at the moment for the next sort of decade on the slate at the moment, which are two which are probably going to happen, and then another two which are sort of competing with those to potentially happen. And I think one of them is a Venus-based mission, but we're talking about 10 years in the future. So the status...
That seems right? How it doesn't... You can't put a satellite together really quickly.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Not Discovery class. It's hard. Okay, the government can do this, but the government can spend $500 million pretty quickly. But the individual program... it's actually not that easy to spend that much money effectively. And so, $500 million, how much can you spend in a given year?
Yeah.
A project where you only have, say you have 40 people working on it. And so, a 5 to 10 year timeline is pretty standard for these kinds of things between selection and launch. Kepler was 7 years, I think, between when it was selected and when it launched.
That sounds about right then. So because the problem we've got at the moment is we have this phosphine signature on Venus. We're thinking it might be life, but it could be other chemistry. So all you're going to be able to do is keep knocking things off, looking at different places on the Earth, trying to understand the chemistry better, seeing if there's other ways to produce phosphine. But you're always inferring, and there's always that possibility that there could be some mechanism that we don't understand. So it seems to all be
chemistry that happens.
Yeah, so it all seems to be leading up to eventually you're gonna have to go there and drop a balloon into the atmosphere of Venus and take a sample and actually, see what's going on there and if there is life there. So her timescales were that there's a mission called Rocket Lab, which is going, I think, towards Venus in 2-3 years, which could do a little bit of at least verifying the phosphine in situ. But it would be 10 years until they could send one of these Discovery class missions with a payload big enough and a microscope to, do the live stream of the bacteria in the clouds of Venus. So it doesn't seem like this is going to be something that's cleaned up for 6, 7 to 10 years, which is
you wouldn't want to spend that much money right away anyways. You'd want to have what you'd ideally have, unless there's stuff that I don't know about Venus, which is a lot. But my suspicion is that they would probably say, let's send a small mission there first to kind of get our good idea of what's going on, and then we'll like invest the big money once we have a better idea of what questions to be asking in the first place.
Yeah.
But maybe they know more about Venus than I perceive. But I suspect that it'll be incremental stuff. So maybe Venus will be the new destination after the Mars stuff.
How do you think this changes the calculus? Because you were saying there, this is going to change the way that people look at, extraplanetary science and particularly life searches. How is it going to change that just by focusing more on Venus, or are people going to? Because I know you've done a little bit of work on panspermia as well. I guess if there were to be life found on Venus, you'd have to also work out whether it was contamination from Venus to Earth, Earth to Venus, from other planets in the solar system, or is this another independent development of life on Venus? And I guess that would be earth-shattering if you could prove that it was two independent developments of life on two planets.
I think panspermia could have happened, because it is all the planets that are near each other. Independent development, that's also just as possible. So. In my mind, maybe it's easier. We don't really know how hard it is to initiate life, for things to start, and so
because we've only got one experiment,
right?
Only got one example.
We've only got one confirmed example, so it may be that life is actually really easy to get started. In that, if the conditions are right, then it will happen almost inevitably. In which case, then a co-evolutionary track would make sense. It's not that hard to deliver stuff from Earth to Venus and have it survive. I mean, you can imagine cockroaches swimming around in Venus's atmosphere because of how, they can survive pretty much everything else. So why not a trip to Venus? Tardigrades, I mean, that's kind of, it's silly, but there is life that can survive in pretty extreme circumstances. And so there's no reason. I did do a calculation at one point on like, what's the temperature increase that you would get? Would it actually melt everything and kill all the life off? And the answer is no, that it doesn't actually take that much. The energy that it takes to melt something is really, really high compared to the amount of energy it takes to just throw it out of the gravitational well. But the fact that it's there now is the real issue. The fact that it's there now means that however it started, it's still there.
Yeah.
If it is life, and it could be something else. Just like
the development is really interesting, actually, like you said, because when I was talking to Professor Seeger, she was saying, look, there's no Earth life that we know of that could survive in these conditions, and that if we're making Earth-like inferences, it suggests that life might have developed on the surface of Venus, which in the past might have been more like Earth. And then it had to migrate up into the clouds, which on the Earth we have a lot of bacteria and microalgae and things like this that get swept up from the surface, spend a little bit of time in the clouds, and then they come back down. So this is not unheard of. But then because Venus's surface is now so hostile, her suggestion is that this stuff developed on the surface, migrated up, and now it sort of stays up in the clouds by some sort of cycling of convective cycling. So you essentially have this situation where you've got life in the clouds of Venus where it's lower pressure, temperature similar to what it is on the Earth, or 30 to 80, which is hot, but, not unsustainable. But where life can't actually fall back to the surface because it'll be destroyed. So this is the sort of one of the hypotheses at the moment, that life sort of metabolizes and lives in these droplets in the clouds. The droplets start to fall through the atmosphere once they bombard together and grow big enough, and the gravity takes over. But as they descend down from the clouds, things get hotter. These things evaporate, and you get this haze layer of sort of desiccated bacteria that sort of lay dormant until they get updrafted again. And then they meet these wetter conditions, go into the droplet, start metabolizing again. So you get this weird sort of convective cycling of bacteria that always stays up in the clouds. It's a very different situation to the Earth, and requires a lot of sort of hand waving and a lot of hypothetical work that hasn't been confirmed. But it's a very difficult place to get life. You have to have it created on the surface, migrate up, and then stay there. There's an awful lot of questions that need to be answered about how it would have started and how it stays, as you say, in situ. How is it still there now?
Yeah,
why is it in the clouds?
I'm kind of skeptical on it, although they did look at what other options are there. So
different photochemistry and geochemistry and all sorts of stuff that we might not.
And like if it is life, now one thing that would be simultaneously interesting and spooky is if it is life and it's not based on DNA. That would be extremely frightening.
And it would throw all our sort of Earth-centric search protocols out of the window, I guess. Why are we going to Mars and Europa and looking for water if you have a completely different form of life?
Yeah, well, because humans aren't really well adapted to living to things that it doesn't know how to handle, like prions. But in terms of like the policy landscape, the motivation, my perception of science for the last decade and how that would shape the 2020s is Mars is always going to be kind of big because we can do it.
Yeah.
I think
and it looks good, right? It looks good when you have a lander and it's sending back selfies of itself, and we can roll it around and we can give it a fancy name, a friendly colloquial name
to get more engineers building bridges.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you have the outer planets that haven't really been visited. So, stuff in the outer solar system, but that's not like a 2020 timescale. That's like a 2030s timescale.
Yeah.
So it's like Uranus and Neptune. But then the other thing that I think really rose up in the last half of the decade is gravity waves. So I think that there's going to be a big push towards getting a gravity wave detector in space. Maybe there's another decade of ground-based stuff to do, but I'm of the opinion that there's going to be a big push towards getting a lot of the gravity stuff up in space as within the next 10 years. So that would be LISA, because the Pathfinder mission's already been built, it's already been flown, a lot of the technical stuff has been addressed, and now the signal has been seen. So we know that the signals are going to be there. And so my suspicion is that LISA, or whatever its next iteration is called,
will steal a lot of the focus over the next sort of.
That will be on kind of the cosmology end. That's going to be the main driver. LSST was for this decade, and it's going to be turning on, and then it's just going to be operations. So the expense has been sunk in LSST, and that's kind of done. James Webb is its own kind of monster because of.
There's always 1 year away. It never seems to. Yeah.
And that will be true for another couple of years probably. And so James Webb, but it became so big because of how poorly spec'd it was. I mean, there's a whole bunch of issues that come into that. One of them being you want to be very careful about loopholes that you allow people to discover. And so if you have a specification that's kind of loose, like as good as you can, as soon as someone says like as good as you can, any contractor who's worth anything is going to be like, as good as you can. All right, that's where we're going to drive the gravy train through, is that one, that where that's not specified, where that specification is not nailed down, that's where you drive the gravy train through.
Yeah, you're getting all the bells and whistles then, if you've not specified exactly what you want.
So, but that'll go up. I suspect it will be successful. There's a lot of technology hurdles that they've had to demonstrate, and we'll get really fantastic science. There are a couple other kind of flagship things that will happen no matter what, because it's not the flagship missions that really get hurt by. Well, once they get going, they're not really the ones that are affected by these kinds of changes, because they're develop over a longer time period.
Yeah.
But but I think it really does. You may see Venus may supplant Europa as the next major destination. I could imagine Venus supplanting an outer gas giant mission.
Yeah.
And so it changes the calculus once you get south of Mars on the list. And I think Mars is the top of the list right now for almost everything, just because there's so much you can do there. That it really changes the dynamic in planetary science, the planetary science division of NASA. Yeah. Which, it's fine. I mean, I think there's a lot of people discover it. And I know people who have spent their careers working on Venus, and now they're basically retired. The opportunity to actually take on it has appeared.
Yeah.
It's one of the forgotten children in the solar system.
Yeah.
So in that regard, it's kind of cool. And the same thing I think will happen. We're going to see new axion type measurements made to focus on the signal that was seen in that 1-ton xenon experiment.
Yeah, yeah.
So, that's kind of the nature of things. I think it's a big deal that they saw the signal, especially since they apparently spent a lot of time kind of ruling out everything that they could think of.
Yeah.
It's not one of those like, oh, we saw water vapor when we looked at this star, but we didn't subtract the water vapor out of the atmosphere, and so.
Yeah. They seem to have spent a lot of time dealing with potential systematics and other effects.
Yeah, so it's not the opera result.
It's not the loose wire for the
right.
faster than light neutrinos. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Which is interesting actually, because they have a 15 sigma finding of phosphine, which even to a particle physicist like me dealing with 15 sigma made me.
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah, it made my head swivel. I was trying to find it. It's not even on Google. Like if you try and Google what is the p-value for 15 sigma, it just gets to about 8 sigma and just stops because the number's too incredibly small. So essentially, they have found phosphine statistically, unless there's some weird systematic error with their data, which doesn't make sense. But they still will have to get an independent confirmation just to make sure. But there's no problem with the statistics. It's just as you say, looking at the systematics, seeing if there's another chemical way to make this phosphine that isn't life. But it's very interesting, and as you say, might change some of the focus. But changing the direction of the big ship, which is going to Mars, is not going to be incredibly easy. We're not going to start sending a mission next week to try and see the end of this. It's going to be a while because there's other things on the docket that need to get done. So. Yeah.
So there was another thing that you sent. Is there any more that you want to talk about?
No. I think that's a nice place to stop that because people want a solution to this, right? And it's quite unsatisfying to realise that it's going to be 7 to 10 years until you get an answer to that, and then it could be an answer in the negative. So unfortunately, we just got to wait and see on that one.
Yeah. Let me pull up. There was another article that you sent me that
yes,
I thought would be kind of funny. I don't know where this came from. I mean, it's coming from the National Institutes of Health.
Which one is this?
The black hole at the center of the Earth.
Oh, I haven't seen this one. You'll have to push this to. Oh, right. You'll have to push it to screen, and then we'll have a look. So what's going on here?
A black hole at the center of the Earth plays the role of the biggest system of telecommunication for connecting DNA-S, dark DNA-S, and molecules of water on 4 plus n- dimensional. Now, so
is this a real paper?
It's on PubMed.gov. Is that a real work?
I don't know.
Is this a real thing? Where did I see this from? Maybe it was someone on Twitter. I've tried to avoid getting on Twitter as much as possible lately.
No, I agree with you. It's not the best place to be most of the time.
So it is possible that this is like some. What is PubMed? Let me look real quick. Is that the actual website? PubMed. I
thought PubMed was like not a journal, but isn't it like a repository?
Yeah, a repository. Okay, so that's a real thing. So what's this? It's the is it Macedonian Journal of Medical Science? Macedonian, yeah, medical. I got their thing. Macedonian Journal of Medical Science. A black hole at the center of Earth plays the role of the biggest system of telecommunication for. Wow.
I don't even know where to start. I don't think I even understand some of the words in the title there.
Okay, so let's take a look at the abstract and see what we can get. Recently, some scientists from NASA have claimed that there may be a black hole-like structure at the center of the Earth. I don't know how recently this was,
okay,
but that's certainly not the case. But okay, so maybe someone funded by NASA said what would happen if there was a black hole at the center of the Earth. We show that the existence of life on Earth may be a reason that this black hole-like object is a black brain that has been formed through biological materials like DNA.
Okay.
That's
out there. That's out there.
Lies a significant misunderstanding of what a black hole is and how it forms. But okay, size of this DNA black brain is 109 times longer than the size of Earth's core.
109 is very specific.
Longer than the size of Earth's core and compacted interior to it. So it's like a black brain, so it's like a two-dimensional black hole surface-like thing that's crumpled up.
So it stays within the bounds of the core.
Yeah. By compacting this long object, curved space-time emerges, and some properties of black holes emerge. This structure is the main cause of the emergence of large temperature of the core somehow. Magnetic field around the Earth and gravitational field for moving around the sun. What? The magnetic field around the Earth and the gravitational field for moving around the sun. Also, this structure produces some waves which act like topoisomerase in biology, and read the information DNAs. However, the four-dimensional manifold DNAs are contracted at least 4 times around various axes, and waves couldn't be their extra dimensions of 4. Anyway, so if you ever have some idea that you want to propose, here's the journal for you.
Apparently, so it sounds like one of these. What was it? SoCal Squared, James Lindsay ones. Dog park sex or whatever it is.
Here's a question that I got in chat. If life is found on Venus and not on Mars, does this affect the attractiveness for human habitation? In other words, do you think life on Venus has any important consequences for humans visiting Venus as opposed to Mars? There are missions about getting humans in balloons going around in the atmosphere of Venus. I don't know how plausible those are. I personally don't know that I would want to visit Venus. Yeah. If your balloon pops, you're dead. So
isn't it on what is it called? The film I love with Arnold Schwarzenegger, Total Recall. Isn't one of the packages you can have installed into your brain, like visit the clouds of Venus, or I'm sure that's one of them that somebody wants to do. So, but in terms of talking about
people that would be like, oh, that sounds like fun, hot air balloon ride.
I'm sure there would be. I'm sure there'd be plenty of people who go up for that. It might be Elon Musk's next venture. But I think in terms of life, Earth-based life, Venus is such a hostile environment for Earth-based life. And I think this is why we focus so much more on Mars, because Earth-based life, what we think of as life, would be much more suited to living on Mars or something that looks like Mars, plus a few degrees. So I think it doesn't say much about humans going to Venus. That's still an incredibly difficult thing. It says that life as we know it would be, has far more facets. If it can survive on Venus, we haven't really seen all that life has to offer, despite its great diversity and on the Earth. We haven't seen half of it, because if it can survive in sulfuric acid and carbon dioxide in the clouds of Venus, then there's life is even more robust than we thought.
Yeah.
Good question, though.
So, all right. Are there any other scientific discoveries that have come out lately?
There was one that came out, but I haven't really had time to look at it. Wasn't it planets around a white dwarf?
Oh yeah, that one. That's a good one to bring up. So that was Andrew Vanderberg was an author on it. I think he's the lead author.
Which might be relevant probably don't want to discuss it to the integral that I sent you that I'm doing. It could be of interest to that. So, but you're going to have to lead on this one because I haven't had a chance to look at this.
I haven't read it in great detail. It was a test discovery. I don't recall the first. I think Vanderberg is the first author. Andrew Vanderberg is the first author. Now, I met Andrew Vanderberg when he was an undergraduate student, and he's a spooky guy. He's really smart. I mean, there are a lot of smart people, but he's someone, and just like he is so prolific. He publishes like 80 papers a year. He just started at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, but he's really nice. He's like super nice guy, really smart, and really prolific. He does a lot of stuff. So this was from the test mission, where they found a white dwarf star with a hot Jupiter orbiting. Now, there is motivation to believe, like we see, a few things about white dwarfs. One is that when you deposit chemicals on a white dwarf, they sink fairly quickly. And so there were a number of observations over the last 10 years, and this is continuing to today, of polluted white dwarfs, where you see chemicals in the spectrum of light coming from white dwarfs, that the lifetime of those chemicals is like 10 to the 4 years or less. Like they sink pretty quickly. And so the fact that you see those chemicals on the white dwarf means that they've been deposited on the white dwarf through collisions with some objects. And so the idea there is that maybe you have asteroids in this system that are plunging in towards the white dwarf star, and then when they hit the surface, the chemistry their chemicals get spread out across the surface, and then they sink over the next decades to centuries to millennia. So over the next some number of years, all those chemicals will sink, and they won't be visible anymore. So the observation of polluted white dwarfs means that there's in real time, effectively real time, astronomically speaking, that in real time.
Yeah. Who cares about a couple of orders of magnitude in astronomy? No one. It's fine.
And so 15 sigma to an astronomer, like I said, is good. Now,
I'm surprised your head didn't explode, because even to a particle physicist who's used to dealing with 10 to the minus 10
so
and such.
It's 15 sigma, assuming that the tails of your distribution are actually structured the way that you claim that they are.
Probably. You're probably getting into that problem.
If the tails of your distribution are fatter, then it's then it's no longer 15 sigma. But so with the spherical cow approximation, it's 15 sigma. But anyways, so when you have this stuff impinging upon the surface of white dwarfs, then you're going to pollute the surface of white dwarfs, and that can tell you what the planets are made out of. Because you're actually measuring the chemistry, because it basically it's hot enough to break everything apart. So you're not getting minerals anymore. You're getting like the raw chemistry of the objects. So that was assumed, like they've seen things breaking apart and like kind of debris disk-like things around white dwarfs. But this is the first time that there's ever been like a hot Jupiter on a one-day orbit, this Jupiter-sized planet going around a white dwarf. That's weird, and there's not really a good explanation for doing this. I did talk to my research group yesterday about like some ideas that we had that we're gonna look into pursuing. I suspect there's a bunch of people who are already writing stuff once they saw this, so it may rapidly not be timely. Like the window to write something interesting about the formation of this thing is probably closing over the course of the hour that we're speaking. And so, but we did have some ideas that we may pursue. A couple of people who were on this paper I collaborate with on other projects, and so I might just recruit them to work with me.
How has this, or what is the relevance of this case? So, how are white dwarfs are remnants? Are they? So, does this suggest that this planet formed after a particular event, or?
So that's the thing, is that. I don't think this is something that you can form after the star dies, because the material that leaves the star at that stage is not really going to form a disk. The kind of disk that you would form planets from would come from collapse or from stealing stuff from a neighboring object. So with millisecond pulsars, the planets that you form around millisecond pulsars probably come from the millisecond pulsars. The reason you can make a millisecond pulsar is that you have two stars next to each other. One becomes a neutron star. The other one becomes a red giant. And then the neutron star it overflows its Roche lobe, and the neutron star steals material from the photosphere of that object, and then that spirals in around the neutron star, and then you form planets within that accretion disk. So you're forming planets from material from the photosphere of a neighboring star to make the pulsar planets. That's I think the prevailing idea. There may be other ideas, but that's the one that I use in my mind. Therefore, it's the prevailing idea. That you steal stuff from a neighboring star, because you need to have a neighboring star in order to make a millisecond pulsar. You can't spin it up without the neighboring star. Pulsars without a neighboring star generally spin around every few seconds. And so to spin it up to 1,000 times that rate, you have to have something coming in and depositing angular momentum on the surface. And therefore you have this accretion disk, and from that disk you can nucleate the formation of planets. To make a Jupiter mass planet around a star that's a white dwarf like this, it's something that undoubtedly had to exist in the system prior to the expulsion of the photosphere. And so how do you get it there? Was it engulfed through the expansion, or, was it scattered in, like the thing forms and then something disrupts the outer part of the system, and so then you put a Jupiter on a highly inclined trajectory? Like maybe there's a neighboring star that passed by and disrupted an outer gas giant. Oh, so that's actually interesting. So this is the second best idea that we've come up with.
But essentially it's expected that it shouldn't be there, because when the photosphere of the star was thrown off, leaving the white dwarf, it would have been expected that anything that close would have been essentially thrown away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so either it would stay, like, how do you scatter it in is the real question, because it had to scatter in from somewhere, because it didn't exist. It's not like it was inside the star. And when the star goes through its red giant phase, that can last for millions of years. And so you're not going to have a planet going around inside a photosphere for millions of years. It would decay. Yeah. So there's, how do you get it there? At what point in the evolution of the system do you get it there? Yeah. The orbits do expand. And so, but like when the orbits expand like that.
So essentially the problem, the problem that we have at the moment is, why the hell is it there? It should have been thrown off when the star went red giant. Why the hell is it there? So it's a little bit of a mystery at the moment, and people are trying to work out why it's there.
This makes me think, I think I know who I need to contact to collaborate on this stuff. Because you could unbind it. If you as the photosphere expands and the star loses mass, then all the orbits expand. So you can imagine then you take a gas giant that's formed quite a ways out in the system. You push it out by a factor of, say, 2, because the mass of the star drops by a factor of 2. And then it's now more susceptible to the influence of passing stars. And then you just have to get close to the binding energy, like unbinding the system, to have it plunge in towards the center. So your eccentricity goes from like 0 to 99.999, which is the effect of unbinding it. And then, because once its eccentricity becomes 1, then you're a parabola. And so then it's coming in right next to the star, and then it just circularizes close to the star. So that's kind of interesting. But like the number of times that you'd have to have that happen, there has to be something that drives it towards roughly this value of orbital period, because otherwise, why would you find this one? You're going to find the most common orbital period, or the biggest. Either you're going to find the easiest one to find, or you're going to find the most common one. Those are the two options really that you have. Yeah. So like the Crab pulsar, it was really bright, so it was the biggest one. But with this thing, what are the different mechanisms of driving something there, and how do you get it so that either that becomes the largest possible signal you can produce, or that's the most common outcome of the dynamical scenario that you put out to do this. Anyways, it's a cool discovery, like a real bona fide hot Jupiter around a white dwarf star. The image that they show actually indicates that the Jupiter, because it's 14 Jupiter masses, so it's pretty big. It's like kind of on the edge of a brown dwarf.
I was going to say, what would be the size discrepancy there between the star and the planet? It doesn't seem like it would be that much.
The planet would be bigger, probably. I don't know what the mass of the white dwarf star is. What's the white dwarf star mass? Mass, huge size of massive than Earth. So because white dwarfs get smaller as they become more massive, and so, but a white dwarf star is only like Earth-sized.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Jupiter's going to be like 10 times bigger than the white dwarf. I mean, I didn't even have to. Had I been thinking properly. So this isn't an M dwarf star, which is the same size as the planet. This is a white dwarf star, which is 10 times smaller than the planet.
So
you're going to have this
bizarre system.
Yeah, if anyone watching the movie just looking at the size would be like, why did they put it centered on the star? It should look like a moon going around the planet, but in fact, it's the planet going around a moon-sized thing.
So it's really, really, really interesting. Probably something for Dave Kipping as well to have a look at. I might have to have a chat with him about it and see if he's got any ideas.
So it's a pretty big. I think it's a cool discovery. What kind of groundbreaking implications it has, don't know yet. But all that someone like me needs is an excuse to write another paper.
There we go. Good.
So that's cool, and congratulations to everyone. It's a big, long author list, but congratulations to Andrew and all the people that are working on it.
Don't talk to me about long author lists. On the LHC papers that I'm on, they instead of trying to work out everyone who had any sort of little impact on the detector or looked after it once or did one line of code that goes into the analysis, they just put everyone in the collaboration on. So if you type in like LHCb paper or something, you'll see the author list. If you type in LHCb Gregson paper or something, try that and see what happens. So LHCb Gregson. Gregson paper or something. Well, that's me. Yeah, so go down one. Try that next one. Try that one.
The document server?
Yeah.
Okay, hold on.
I'll see if you can get an author list up.
LHCb TDR 015.
So that's like technical design report. So that'll be like the design report of the detector, you know, how it's set up, what the different modules are on it, what each module is designed to do, these types of things. But I'm hoping at the start you'll be able to see the author list. Is it there? No. Oh, it is there. There we go. So this is what they do at the start of every paper. They'll just go through every single person from every single institution.
5, 6 pages.
Yeah.
And the institution. Oh, but the institutions only you're on. There aren't that many institutions. Oh no, there's all the other institutions.
Exactly. So what
pages of authors?
Yeah. So you have 6 pages of authors. So for a moment there, before they sort of worked it out, I had one of like the highest p-values or whatever it is on the.
Yeah.
What I can't remember what the letter is, but one H index.
H score.
One of the highest H scores of like one of the most prolific like paper producers of like anyone in the history of Cambridge University ever, because it's completely unfit for purpose. So for those who don't know, H index is this. I think they calculate it by saying if you have one paper, it has to be cited once. If you have 2 papers, they have to be cited twice or something, and 3 papers have to be cited. Each one has to be cited 3 times. So it sort of geometrically scales up. But obviously, if anyone looks at any LHCb paper, even if I did no work on it, which is the vast majority of the papers, counts as one of my papers. So I had this absurd H index. I can't remember what it was, but
that's how it works.
For a little bit of time, because of these very odd 6-page author lists. But it's kind of fun for a while there.
Anyways, those are the observations. They have some parameters on there. There's the transit.
Okay. So this is the test transit.
So it's pretty cool. This looks like the spectroscopic. So this is the confirmation, I guess, that it's a white dwarf. Because wait, but the temperature. Okay, so the temperature peaks. The peak wavelength is at
5,000 Angstrom.
That's actually kind of big. Is this the star or the planet spectrum? Because this is a 5,000. This is like 7,000 angstroms. That's like 700 nanometers. That seems like maybe that's the planet. This must be something on the planet. Because if a white dwarf star should be like half of this wavelength.
I'll have to have a look. I'll have to have a look at that paper.
Yeah, I don't know. So that I don't understand, because it seems it doesn't match my preconceived notion about. So anyways, that was a cool result.
Yeah, it was a cool result. So the only other thing I had, we've been talking for a while now. If you want to chat about one more thing, or if you want to call it a day, I don't mind. But the only other thing that I sort of sent through to you was this article that I saw of Scientific American explicitly endorsing Joe Biden for the US election. I don't know if you can bring up the article.
I can look for it.
If you just type in Scientific American endorses Joe Biden or whatever, it should come up. Yes, the top one. So the story is that Scientific American, which apparently has been going for 175 years, which I thought was mind-boggling. I don't know. Is that true? 175 years?
Yeah, it's pretty long.
That's absurd. In any case, they've taken the
bold step.
The bold step. There we go. That's what I needed. The bold step of backing a presidential candidate for the first time in those 175 years, and essentially they've said it's because Trump is so bad for science that Scientific American needs to essentially step in. And I just sort of wanted to save us from ourselves. Save us from ourselves. I wanted to get your thoughts on that, if you had any.
I do not have a good opinion of this particular choice. Let me pull up. I gave a talk at the Las Vegas March for Science in 2008.
Yeah.
And where do I have a link to this? It might take me a second to.
All right. Well, maybe if I give my initial take on this, then
you give your.
You're pulling that up, because my initial take, super initial, hot take, saw it and wasn't particularly pleased, was kind of stop dragging science or politics into science. So, the idea of science
enough is that already. Why add more?
Well, yeah, exactly. We have to try and be as impartial as possible politically. Obviously, that's impossible. Scientists are humans. We have social impacts in science. I get all that. But then you have loads of people just saying, oh, well, science is done by humans and therefore it's political. I think the idea is to try and keep it out as much as possible. Obviously, we're not going to be able to do it completely, but we try and keep it out as much as possible. And an explicit endorsement is obviously not doing that. Now, I've softened a little bit on that, because when I actually read this article, it kind of comes in two parts for me. There's one part where they're calling out the scientific failures of Trump. They're talking about him, saying climate change is a Chinese hoax, or, defunding certain agencies, or, failing to get track and trace up for coronavirus, which some scientists said was a good idea, these kind of things. And I think it is reasonable for a scientific publication to criticize a politician for what they see as attacks on science or defunding science. I think that's within their remit. But I think the problem is there's a very fine line between that, attacking someone for what they're doing in the science sphere and then endorsing another candidate. I think there's a very fine line there where they've probably overstepped and become too biased. And, a lot of people, scientists who are Democrat leaning, they were jumping up and clapping this and saying, obviously you should be doing this and we can't afford to be neutral and all this sort of thing. But I think you have to be very careful when you're going to wade into this sort of arena and become overtly political. So I didn't really like it. I don't mind them pointing out when Trump says a falsehood in science or attacks science unjustifiably. I think that's their role. But when you're explicitly endorsing a candidate, I think you really, it just doesn't sit right with me in terms of the science.
Yeah, and honestly, I wouldn't. I don't even think it's a fine line. I think it's a gigantic line that the people were totally blind to when they stepped over it. Because and I haven't managed to find this thing yet. It's on my. Can someone in the chat pull up? It's listed on my channel page. The link to the talk that I gave. That's probably the fastest way to get it.
There's another poll up, by the way. So if anyone's in the chat and wants to have their say on this, you can vote in the chat by doing !vote, yes or no, or don't know. So see what people think about that.
Okay, so let me pull up. This is a talk that I gave to the Las Vegas March for Science.
Yep.
2018, and there's a part here at the bottom where, okay, so let's see what I say. Science can reduce humanity to nothing more than the reconstituted ashes of dead stars and simultaneously ennoble it to the greatest and rarest gift that the universe offers. As teachers, learners, and practitioners of science, we can use the incredible and awe-inspiring truths of science to bring people together, to open their eyes and minds to the natural wonders surrounding them. Let them escape their lives for a moment to touch, feel, and see the infinite. It is crucial that we show these truths to our fellow men and women, that we let them see the wonders of our universe. It is also crucial that we not impede their vision with our pettiness, that our pride or arrogance not become a stumbling block. Discovery, when done right, is a humbling experience for all. It exposes us to the immense void of space, the deep abyss, and the microscopic unknown. We must not trifle with that message. We must not use science as a tool of division. We cannot allow it to become partisan. And to the extent that it has already trodden that path, it is imperative that we bring it back. Make no mistake, science is a two-edged sword. It cuts both ways and is no respecter of persons or parties. Ideologically correct science was championed in both the socialist utopia of the Soviets, where bourgeois science was suppressed by the gun and the gulag, and the Aryan utopia of Nazi Germany, where Jewish science met a similar fate in the ghetto and the gas chamber. Truly, when science becomes partisan, it dies a tragic death. Any political ideology that cherry-picks the science it will accept does so at the peril of this great nation and the people of the world. It matters not whether that cherry comes from the branch of medicine and epidemiology with the threat of widespread disease. This was 2 years ago. Or
very prescient.
Yeah, you're welcome. Or climatology with the threat of widespread famine, from psychology or biology, from nuclear physics or genetics. Science cuts both ways. As we advance our transcendent cause to learn about our universe and to employ that knowledge for good and freedom of all, I urge each of us to take great care in our choices of allies and adversaries. We must not alienate those who are actually our most valuable friends in this work. If we want to ensure that science instead of religion is taught in our science classes, we must not alienate those religious individuals who share that goal. As a practicing scientist and a practicing person of faith, I am often dismayed by short-sighted science advocates who jab and prod and belittle those with whom they disagree in order to score points with their particular choir. By doing so, they paint many people who can more effectively deliver the needed message into a corner, thereby weakening an important bridge to those who may be beyond our feeble reach. I am dismayed by lawmakers who, in grandstanding eloquence, signal with virtue and righteousness their abhorrence for their political counterparts, while simultaneously alienating those on the other side who share their desire to see the beneficial advance of science and society. I challenge each of us, all who value science, who are formal science educators, informal science educators, and science advocates, to use our great message to inspire awe and appreciation, to unite rather than to divide, to rise above our tendencies to belittle and blame. I challenge each of us to build bridges to our audience, that they too may see what we have seen, hear what we have heard, and feel what we have felt. So there are...
I've got a tear in my eye.
So there are... Astronomy in particular has many supporters across like all demographics. You can go to the ghetto and you'll see people wearing NASA t-shirts and sweatshirts. So NASA, like astronomy in particular, has this great capacity to reach across like demographic lines. You have Elon Musk, you have like the most wealthy people in the country and the poorest people in the country who love astronomy. you have people all across the political spectrum who are big fans of astronomy and science in general. Anyone who claims otherwise needs to get out of their bubble. I speak with groups from all different backgrounds, religious groups. I speak to secular groups. I speak to conservative groups. I speak to groups all over the place, and people have always expressed to me the appreciation that they have for this stuff. This is something that takes a long time to build and an instant to destroy. It's like the comment by one of the naval admirals. I don't remember what the battle was, but there was some naval battle where the description from the admiral was, it takes centuries to build a naval tradition and like days to destroy it. And while there may be scientists who say, yeah, this is one more point against Donald Trump, don't we feel good about ourselves? It's like you're toying with something that takes you far longer to build than it takes to destroy, and you are alienating the most important people, because we're already in the choir. Like, the people that celebrate this are already in the choir. The people that you need to convince are the ones who are in the congregation. And by doing that, you're just giving them one more reason you're pushing. It's one more thing pushing them away from you.
Well, it strikes me that one of the biggest reasons that Donald Trump won the election in 2016 was this sort of populist message that the elitists don't really understand you. They're not trying to help you. They think you're deplorables. They think you're, Bible bashers and these sort of derogatory terms. And then here we have quite an elitist organization sort of feeding into that and saying, well, actually, we just want Joe Biden. We don't like your guy. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not all of that. And there are legitimate criticisms. But I think, as you say, and I'm sure they weighed this up, but I don't see the massive benefit of doing this.
I don't think they weighed it at all, because the stuff that they write, I mean, maybe they did, or maybe they think that they did, but
well,
they didn't.
I have some problems with the things that are written as well, to be honest, because some of them are just, it's not really science at all. It's just politics.
Yeah, so some of the things that they say here, and like, Joe Biden's going to do this and that and the other, it's like you're letting Joe Biden speak for you.
Well, if you go right to the bottom, it's hidden, buried the lead right to the last paragraph. It says something like, we don't actually know how much of this will Joe Biden... Oh, there it is, the second to last paragraph. It's not certain how many of these or his other ambitions Biden will be able to accomplish. So, it's all well and good having these highfalutin ideas, and maybe they align with certain scientific principles and, they align with your politics, but you don't know how much of it is going to even be able to do or is going to do. So you just, as you said, you're letting him speak for you with a lot of... Well, and that's not really science, it's just politics.
Right. Another thing that this does is I think they demonstrated their lack of knowledge of what the current administration's policies are on some of these issues. Mm-hmm. So, for example, here they're talking about, we're going to establish research agencies to develop safe nuclear power and carbon capture technologies. It's like, do you know what the current administration's policy is regarding the development of safe nuclear power and carbon capture technologies? No, because if you did, you would find that it's basically the same as what they're proposing. And beyond that, if you look at, say, my state's political parties, you will find that the sign flips on which one supports nuclear energy and the development of nuclear technologies compared to the other. So, I mean, I read through this and I'm like, these are not written by people who they're like, his platform is going to do all these things. It's like they're letting Joe Biden speak for them. And that is not what a scientific thing should do. A scientific body should say, this is what the science says, and so when you construct policies, it should be based upon what we understand from the scientific principles. Have at it. Go ahead and argue with each other about the best approach to make. But
well, there's a very you're sort of pushing at this door, but there's a very dangerous idea of saying this is what the science says, and therefore the policy should be this, because the science is optimized with respect to some metric, and then when you go into the politics, all sorts of other things start coming in. Economics, social values, people's different moralities and such, and everything gets muddled. And and convolve through that prism. So just going from the science says this and Joe Biden says he's going to do this. Well, what metrics are you dealing with? What, I don't know what you're saying. You're doing a scientism. You're saying science says this and this is a paper and now suddenly there's a policy.
That's right. Well, and this is the issue that that is lost on journalists who aren't interested in reporting the nuances of a discussion and are rather interested in finding ways to advance their own political agenda in a given environment, is that when, in terms of like, well, for example, Dr. Fauci, the doctors who were on the coronavirus task force in the United States.
Fauci and Birx.
Yeah. It was never in their purview to dictate economic policy. And they are the ones that said that. If you ask them themselves, they'll say, this is what things happen, and this is how we understand how this is going to spread, and this is how we should respond to it. And that's what we bring to the table. We bring to the table an understanding of epidemiology and viral things and medicine and stuff like that. But they don't bring to the table understanding of, logistics and food preparation and things like that. And so, but if you're a reporter and you want to score points with your political side and basically trap the president in something, you'll say, why aren't you following the advice of the medical doctors, when that's not the only person that he's getting advice from? And whether he responded correctly or not is irrelevant to the fact that he's going to be getting advice from a variety of different people with expertise in a variety of different aspects of society.
This is what I'm saying. It's not to say that he didn't do things wrong, because he definitely did. And I mean, his rhetoric on a lot of things is absolutely horrendous. Like we know this. Come on, everyone knows this. He talks a lot of rubbish. There's a lot of bluster, but
he brainstorms in front of an audience. That's what.
Yeah,
that's kind of the way. When I watch him go off on things, he's like, "Oh, did you think about this? Have you thought?"
The things that I might say to you in an email where we're thrashing out how we might think about something is all laid bare for the for the media to see.
Yeah. So, anyways, but that's something that I'm glad for the federal system, where not everybody has to follow exactly the same plan for reopening their economy, and we'll be able to see a couple of years from now what really happened, and we'll have 50 different experiments to inform us on what happened. But that's a separate issue. And that being aside, I think that scientists don't realize how easy it is to squander the good graces that the good position that we hold. Scientists, by and large, are among the most trusted professionals in the populace as a whole. If you list like the topmost trusted professions, you get things like school teacher, scientist, superhero, those kinds of things. And then down at the very, very bottom, is reporters and politicians and stuff like that. And so the fact that this organization is going to take this where they are and align themselves with the bottom of the stack when it comes to like broad acceptance I think is a major failure of optics on their part.
Yeah.
It's alienating precisely the wrong people. It's precisely the wrong people that they're alienating.
Yeah, it's
they're alienating the people who will vote across party lines. And I think it was a big mistake, and
I mean, my sense of it, and I mean, you kind of pushed at this door again, is that a lot of the stuff isn't that Trump is a science denialist. I mean, yes, on climate change, I think he said some very stupid things, saying it's a Chinese hoax and all this sort of nonsense.
Yeah, but then on his golf courses, he implements things to address the rising sea levels. So.
Well, okay, but I don't think he should be saying that stuff. But then I think
I agree.
That doesn't necessarily. So I am sympathetic to the idea that if the president is signaling and saying that certain things are not in his thinking, the science behind climate change doesn't figure into his thinking, then that is a problem. And it is right for Scientific American to to criticize them about that. That is within their remit. But I think if you're going to trade off the idea that you're a scientific institution, and yes, people have said to me, look, Scientific American is a private magazine and they're not an institution really of science, they're a private magazine. They're still trading off this idea. The common perception in the public is that they're a very well-respected scientific magazine, and they use the word science in to trade off. And I think with that comes some level of responsibility to at least feign being politically neutral in certain issues. And I think, as you said, they've overstepped that line here. And with Trump, I think there has to be some line drawn between the fact that the guy talks a load of nonsense and a load of rubbish and what actually gets done, which again, there are a lot of things you can criticize for, particularly in the dealing with COVID.
The thing is, like, how many presidents, like, what do they know about the different presidents? There's 175 years of presidents. Okay, so we're going back, we're talking about Polk, we're talking about Buchanan, we're talking about Chester A. Arthur, we're talking about Woodrow Wilson, and all this, like, all the racist stuff, and like.
Well, isn't it? Well, that's interesting that you mentioned that.
That comes from the political left that's been around for the last, the whole progressive eugenics and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. It's the same people. It's all academics who think that they're like, oh, we're the smart people in the room.
Well, it's interesting that you push at that, because 175 years, and it's only this year that Scientific American. I mean, let's just say if it's only now that they think things are bad enough to have to comment on something. Let's just say they've been asleep at the wheel for quite a lot of horrible things that have happened in American history over the last 175 years. Now, I don't want to get caught in whataboutism, but that suggests that there's other aspects rather than how terrible Donald Trump is that are at play in making this, in putting out this article, whether it be, virtue signaling or the fact that social media is here and they felt like they needed to say something.
And these aren't the same editors that existed back then, but I mean, there are a lot of presidents between now and 175. What is 175 years ago? That's 1840.
Yeah.
Is that 1840? So it's you go back to. There's a lot of presidents leading up to the Civil War. You're almost back. It's 200 years to Andrew Jackson. Oh no, Andrew Jackson was 1832, right? So you're almost back to Andrew Jackson. Which. Good things and bad things from everybody. It's not, but I mean, there were complete dolts in the White House in the intervening years. Like Harding, and people who made pretty egregious mistakes in a whole bunch of things. And in particular, there were academics who became part of the presidency who did really stupid things in the midst of pandemics that existed in their societies. Right, the flu pandemic that went through in 1918. You had an academic who believed in eugenics. It's like, I don't know. Maybe they're only choosing what history they want to read, but there's a lot of stuff that they're playing with the wrong. They're playing with their credence, and what I think is going to happen is that people are going to ignore them. Like, I didn't want, this too. My shoes are political now. My lawn decorating, pink flamingos, is that going to be the next thing that people go after? Pink flamingos are political. So I can't have pink flamingos in my front yard. I can't put my car up on cinder blocks. I have to wear certain kinds of shoes.
Where do you think? So we're talking here about, this is 175 years, and they've decided to step in now. And I don't want to get caught in whataboutism, because they'll say, "Oh well, we should have stepped in the past. We're stepping in now." Okay, fine, whatever.
But they'd be wrong then too.
Well, okay, fine, but they'll say, we're stepping in now. Why do you think it's now that they've decided to step in? Is it just the hysteria in the media? The fact that there's social media there, people are looking in, people are putting pressure on them in the media. Why is it now that people feel things are so horrific that they need to step in? Is is it that we so much focus on the climate with people like Greta Thunberg and people like this speaking, and then Trump is very dismissive of climate things? What
I think there is some catastrophizing, unfortunately, and this happens a lot in the physical sciences. I think that academics and scientists use climate change as a proxy for all science. And therefore, and gives them an excuse, or the majority of them an excuse, not to criticize or not to apply the same standard to other things. It's like that's the litmus test. Climate change or not, if you answer correctly, then you're on my side, and if not, then you're on the other side.
Yeah.
And it's not even necessarily like, is it true or not? I mean, Trump's 74 years old. Like, Republicans that are in their 30s, by and large, have no problem recognizing the existence of climate change. I think there are a couple things at play. One of them is that academics and people in these kinds of institutions, they're in a bubble. They don't talk to people who they disagree with. I mean, my first scientific conference, right? I go to the scientific conference and I'm rooming with some people, and they're like, Republicans are this way, that way, or the other way, and they're just bad, stupid people. And I was like, do you know any? And they said no. I'm like, you don't know anybody. You've never spoken to one, or maybe you have and you didn't realize it. You don't know what you're talking about. If you haven't actually spoken to someone, then why are you painting them with this brush? And it's just like, they're allowed to be ignorant of these things because they're in the schoolyard. They've been in the schoolyard. Someone in my position, when I retire from academia, I will have spent 60 years in the schoolyard. And, there's some introspection, and of course I'm self-righteous about this, but there's some introspection that is warranted when you don't interact with people who disagree with you.
Yeah.
So, and that's kind of what's materializing. I think it's coming home to roost because there was a big demographic, the demographics of higher education in particular changed significantly over the last probably 20 years. An institution like mine, the mix in the professors, in the professoriate is relatively reasonable relative to the country as a whole. But if you go to some of the further you go up the food chain, like the higher you get in the food chain in academia, the more politically isolated the people become.
Yeah.
There's plenty of studies that show, like, once you start getting above the state school, and you start getting into the Ivy Leagues and like really high-end liberal arts colleges, that the professoriate just totally skews to the left. And so if that's the predominant location where you both train new college professors, and because Harvard is disproportionately represented in college professors, and so if that's where the college professor training comes in, and also the training for the institutions, the Department of Education institution plans and things like this, it's going to drive. Now you have people that grow up in the cities, they don't even know what corn looks like when it's growing. To them, corn is a thing you get in a can or a package. They have no idea like what they're talking about when it's outside of their environment, and then they are overrepresented in some institution that's located in Washington, D.C., for example. I don't know where Scientific American's headquartered, but it would be in New York or Washington, D.C. or something like that. It's not going to be in Omaha.
I got my friend Tank in the chat. He's just saying, I guess what he's saying this is all about cash, and by which I guess he's saying, there's money, as we were talking about earlier with the media, there's money in leaning towards your choir and selling these ideas and stroking people's confirmation bias and playing with politics. And maybe it's it's just a problem of alignment of ideals. If you want to sell enough magazines, then learn a certain way, or you want to drive enough clicks. Maybe that feeds into it as well. Just bring in a comment from the chat.
It's possible, and that actually goes into something that has happened over the last 10 years that is many people I think don't want to recognize, is that the donors to different political sides has actually switched. So in the 80s and 90s and 70s and 60s, the wealthy businessmen donors and the oligarchs and stuff like that, they basically were Republican. And that was true up through the 2000s, basically. It was the bankers and the oil magnates and all that stuff. They were the heavy donors into the Republican Party. That has switched. The billionaires, like the big money spenders, are donating to the left now. And so the idea that that is going to cater to the blue collar working class individuals and stuff like that is, it's as much as a sham as it was in the past.
I remember I saw a meme on Twitter this week, and it was it basically just said, middle class saying help me, and then it was Republicans no, Democrats no, with a rainbow flag and BLM after it. It was just like they're both basically the same. This was the idea anyway in that meme.
There was a study about make no mistake about this. There was a study where they surveyed, if you had to cut funding to the United States government, what would you cut? And so this was a survey of people in Congress in the United States not that long ago, just like 8 years or something like that. So they listed all the things you would cut. So there's every agency, all the programs, so Social Security and welfare programs and medical and Veterans Affairs and all these things. They listed every line item in the thing. What would you cut first? The Republicans would cut science funding first. Okay? The Democrats would cut science funding second, after the military. So
I haven't seen that study, but
so it was done by, I don't remember who it was done by, but the guy gave a talk at the American Astronomical Society meeting where he's talking like, this is the reality of the situation. And this was, like 2011 or something like that. So it wasn't that long ago. And it's just, that just goes to show, don't kid yourself thinking that, that a political party values your scientific endeavors, because that's not true. And the evidence, the empirical evidence, is actually, in terms of funding, that the hard sciences do better under Republican administrations. So like physics, chemistry, those kinds of things, they get more money under Republican administrations than they do under Democrat administrations. And that's been true for decades. And occasionally you get someone who knows, and they're like, yeah, that aside from the fact that they're better, I still don't like them because they're still evil. So I look forward to the time, when people can get back together again, because there are things that you'll say on Twitter that you won't say face to face to someone. Yeah. And I think that I think that we are seeing the consequences of kind of the unraveling of the social contract. Yeah. I think this is an example of that. Like, there's a social contract that's involved with, like, where that our overarching agenda is science and not politics, and that's a contract, so people can buy into that as like the superstructure. But then when that superstructure all of a sudden shifts and says, no, actually we're standing over here, that's an unraveling, further unraveling of the social contract. And these contracts are being built at the same time that they're being unraveled. But I look forward to the time when people can actually get back together face to face, have real friends as opposed to virtual friends. Not that I have because we kind of have a virtual friendship. But like, Twitter followers are not your friends. Yeah. And anyone, if all of your friends agree with you politically, then they're not. You don't know that they're your friends. You actually don't know how good your friendships are. Yeah. If your friends, if you can't have political disagreements with your friends, then you don't have friends.
Well, there's quite a few people who since I started talking about politics and trying to work out the ideas that I had around politics, who just won't talk to me anymore, who you know, I've had to block because they just become really nasty and screechy, and you know, and you're right. It is important to keep a white. I try desperately not to block anyone or mute anyone because I want to see all the different ways of seeing things. It's really important to me. I'll talk to anyone on politics or have anyone on the podcast because I think it's really, really important for me as an individual and excuse me, just for the discussion in a wider sense. The only people who I'll block are people who start going ad hominem and, you know, just screaming in all caps because I just don't find it useful.
So an example, and this is someone that someone that I've known professionally. I won't go too much into detail about the person because, and they said something about, they're like, oh, there's this, you know, this is one of those at the time when they did the strike for like the STEM, stay home for minority voice. I don't remember what it was. And I was like, I don't know how me taking a day off is going to help my students. Anyways, so they did that and like amplify the voices of people, which, okay, fine. You know, it's important for people to get exposure and, you know, I'm fine advocating for people's results. So, and then they had said, you know, here's this person that's from some place, and it turns out that they were from a different place. And so there was this big, long apology about, oh, I screwed up. I'm so sorry that this person, you know, I said they were from Trinidad and actually they were from Tobago. And I'm like, you need better friends. If this is what your friends expect of you when you make a mistake, then you need better friends. I would leave these people behind if that's what they're expecting of you, because you need someone who's going to have your back when you make a mistake, and you need someone that can help you through it. And
it's sad, actually. I see a lot of this from certain academics, Cambridge academics that I dealt with, that they're very quick to turn on anyone who moves away from the current, you know, ideology or way of looking at things. And, you know, people make mistakes, you know, people need to work their way through their thinking on certain things. And you know, people are gonna say the odd stupid thing from time to time.
Well, and not only that, but people are actually going to say, you know, believe things that you don't believe, and you're going to have disagreements with. And so if your friendship only goes as deep as, basically your friendship kind of goes as deep as the worst conversation you can have. Like that's one way of modeling it. And so if you can only handle, like, if the sticking power of your friendship is only like your worst comment in a given week or month, then that shows you how deep your friendships are. But if you can do something and have someone say like, look, you screwed up on this one, but I'm here for you. You know, we'll get through this. The friend that you want is the person who will visit you in prison. Right?
What did they say? What was another meme? Sorry to keep pushing the memes, but I think it was, a good friend is someone who'll pay your bail from prison, but your best friend is the one sat in there laughing and saying that was awesome. So that was in the same spirit, I feel. Good. I think we've talked for ages now, haven't we? I probably need to
2.5 hours. I just got rated by about 150 people, but
oh, well, I mean, if you wanted to, we could do a very quick 5-10 minutes on this Trump saying he won't leave office, or we can call it here. So
it's probably, I think I told you my thoughts on that.
Can you get the article up just so people can see what's going on?
I actually would prefer not to.
Right.
Because I haven't seen the original footage.
Fine.
So my approach to when it comes to headlines about Donald Trump is, I see a headline and I say, huh, and then I go and watch the original footage. I go look it up. I want to see the whole half-hour long press conference that this is talking about, and see how the 4 words fit into the broader press conference. And then I will pass judgment. So I have not seen that yet for this particular headline.
Right. Well,
I will say
we'll park that one for now then.
Yeah, I will say that that was when he made, apparently a similar comment 4 years ago. That was the thing that basically made it so that 4 years ago I would not vote for Donald Trump because of that comment, a similar comment that he made. In the intervening 4 years, I think that actions speak louder than words, and the actions that are the result of the previous election did not match what was portrayed in the rhetoric. And I will say that
are you insinuating that the Democrats never really accepted the result of that election?
Would I say something like that? And I voted for him, right? Well, I voted at the top of the ticket for it. I've never had a ballot that did not split the ticket. I've always had both Republicans and Democrats, and usually a libertarian person on the people that I vote for. I've never had a ballot where it was a single party all the way down. And I don't foresee that changing. But you only have to go back 3 weeks when a major player, hopefully the sooner this person is no longer a major player in the party, the better, but a major player among the Democrats was saying that Joe Biden should not concede under any circumstances. And I'm like, what's the difference? And in one case, the actions are one way. In the other case, the words are the same. The actions are different in both cases. So I'm not really sympathetic to the Guardian's headline. I will go back and listen to it. I suspect I know kind of how it came out of his mouth. And so
it was basically, I don't like postal voting, so I think it'll be really fraudulent. So,
and there's a lot of evidence that supports that, right? I don't know if it gets reported in the UK, but in New Jersey, there's an election that has to be redone because of mail-in voting fraud. There's at least a half a dozen places where there's 10,000 ballots in a local election that were mishandled or re-lost, but it's glossed over because I think for partisan reasons. I think there are legitimate reasons to be concerned about sending out a whole bunch of stuff, but it's a partisan thing, and therefore everyone has picked what they believe about it, regardless of the actual results of actual elections that were conducted under these circumstances in recent memory, like within the last 12 months, that are basically being overturned, ruled unconstitutional, being done again, for exactly the reasons that people are worried about. And so I'll have to
have a look at those. I haven't had enough time to look at the history of mail-in voting in the United States, to be honest. My understanding from what you get in the press was that there's a low level of fraud in them, or there's not a lot of evidence of fraud in them, but I don't know. I would have to look at that.
There's an important distinction that is overlooked by people who want to be able to use the same term to mean two different things, between absentee ballots, because I voted absentee ballots for a decade in Seattle and stuff like that. And like the fact that it's a Mott and Bailey argument in many cases, where it's like, I don't know, it's people aren't willing to use terms that mean things. So, and they'll use the same terms to mean two different things, so that they don't have to, concede problems. And it's ridiculous. And it's been ridiculous forever, and it will continue to be ridiculous forever. And I honestly, I expect better of my colleagues, and myself included. Like, if I ever do this, I'm happy to be called out for it. But I expect better of people who claim to be smart, and nuanced, and like, oh, we're the nuanced ones because, all the Republicans that I imagine in my mind are stupid idiots. And,
well, I always say, if you're going to keep losing elections, we talk about Trump in the United States. We talk about Brexit over here. We talk about the last election with Labour and the Tories. If you're going to keep losing elections and saying you're the smart ones, maybe you're not quite as smart as you thought, or as convincing as you thought. Maybe you need to think about the attitudes and the style of rhetoric and the arguments that you're putting out there, and make them more attractive to the electorate, rather than saying that everyone who doesn't agree with you is a bigot and a racist and a scumbag. I mean, that's if I'm going to portray myself as a smart one, it's me who has the ability to change and the ability to say things in a different way, because supposedly I'm the smart one. There's only so long you can keep saying you're smart whilst not convincing anyone.
Yeah, so this is one thing Neil deGrasse Tyson said it really well when he pointed. I think he was talking to, what's the guy's name? The career atheist.
Richard Dawkins.
No, I thought it was the other one.
My friend Tank says he doesn't accept anything from the media at the moment, which unless it's been independently fact checked, and I think a lot of people are starting to feel that way.
Yeah, read the transcripts. If you see a headline that gets you all riled up, read the transcripts, go to the original source, read it, and then formulate your opinion. And that's been true in the United States probably for a lot longer than I would like to have admitted, but it became true for me with misreporting about 3 years ago on a number of events where I'm like, I don't trust you guys anymore, and so I'm going to go to the original sources as much as possible and formulate my opinion from there. Local journalism generally does pretty well. So a lot of coverage of the riots and stuff like that happened through local, like newspapers and TV stations and stuff. So Neil deGrasse Tyson to Sam Harris basically said, you can either, like, science communication is making bridges, like building bridges to other people. And he said, you can either say, here's the data, either you're an idiot or you're not.
No, this is the Dawkins. It's the one I said you. It was the Dawkins.
So here's the data, either you're an idiot or you're not, or you can actually, make the connection to people. And it's what I said in my talk. I said that
it's the job of an educator, right? The job of an educator is not just to say, there's the information, get it or you're an idiot. It's here's the information. And he says when he's talking, he says, here's a sensitivity to your state of mind, which will help you to process and take on board and think about that information and integrate it into your thinking. And so being an educator is coming at it in a way that the person will trust you and take that information on board, not just giving out factually accurate information.
So what I said in my talk, because I've done this, like in my personal life in a number of situations where if you have to tell someone that they're wrong and kind of convince them otherwise, and they come to a realization that they were wrong on something or that they need to change. Like if you're talking to someone face to face and they see that they need to make a change in something.
It's hard to do in front of the person, right?
It's incredibly humbling.
Yeah.
Like you tutor people. I tutored people. When someone finally gets it, like you're working with them, you're like, oh my gosh, how can you not get this? I don't understand.
Yeah.
And when it finally clicks to them, and in that moment you're like, oh my gosh, I hope I didn't screw this up by being an idiot.
Yeah.
Like by being belligerent while they were figuring it out. Because when they figure it out, it's a
beautiful thing.
I hope I didn't wasn't too harsh on them as they were figuring it out, because it's really humbling. Yeah. And so I say that discovery, when done right, is an incredibly humbling experience for everybody. And if it's not a humbling experience for you, then you shouldn't be an educator. Yeah. It's an incredibly humbling experience to watch someone transform and grow, and like overcome, whatever it might be. Like watching people quit smoking. It's really humbling. And so that kind of having that kind of position or expecting that kind of transformation in someone requires perhaps more humility than I have to offer, but it requires a level of humility that's important to recognize. And I don't blame people for getting their back up straight when they're belittled. Maybe they're still wrong in doing so, and maybe that they should be able to recognize it. But
there's two sides to that story.
There's two sides to it. Yeah.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I think if your attitude of coming to something is, if you don't agree with me, you're an idiot or you're a scumbag, then as you say, I don't think you have any role in the education business, because I think you're going to be incredibly ineffective.
And everyone should go back and watch the stream and see how much of a hypocrite I am. Because and part of it is out of frustration from not having, when you have regular conversations with people, nothing builds up. Things have a chance to be settled before they escalate. And so as people become increasingly isolated from each other because they're not supposed to go out and they're supposed to be far apart, and you can't hug your friend when you see him in the street, even though he's a communist and you don't want to talk to him. Well, it's not that you don't want to talk to him. He's a communist and you're going to disagree on that, until you're both dead. Yeah. But by having that lack of face-to-face contact with people is really destructive to society. And so, and when it builds up, and then when you have a chance to vent it out, sometimes you get it out of your system. And I feel bad for the people who, who I have the opportunity to express myself on, because they get to, like, all the conversations
the venting
bouncing around in my head, like they all come rushing out at once.
There has been a few people who've sort of said that maybe a lot of the disquiet, although there is a lot of relevant problems that people have to deal with, to some extent has been exacerbated by the fact that people have been sort of cooped up at home for months on end.
I have no doubt.
Yeah, and perhaps that feeds into it. It's quite liberating just to get out on the streets and be shouting and doing something.
Yeah, and social media, the preceding decade and a half contributed to that problem as well, because people started mistaking their Twitter followers as their friends, and as opposed to like having real friends, like flesh and blood people that they go to the restaurant with and they yell at each other and tell you, oh, you're ruining the thing, you can't do this. But hey, at least with the soccer team is our, we have our favorite football team or whatever.
I said I have a friend. It's actually online, to sort of go slightly against your point, but he and I have relatively similar political leanings, but we're both science background, and he'll come in when I say something on Twitter which is perhaps a little bit hot-headed or a hot take, a little bit reflexive, and he'll say, think about this, this, and it's incredibly useful to me, because usually I see the edges of my argument, and usually I'll end up incorporating 10, 15, 20% of what he said and say, yeah, actually I could soften the edges of what I've said and be a lot more sensible about what I'm saying and more robust in what I'm saying.
Yeah,
I find it incredibly useful. Like, if I ever get into a state where I'm just screaming into a microphone on one side of an argument, I've completely gone off track of what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, it's important to, and this is advice I would give to the President of the United States: think twice, tweet once. And it's advice that I hope that I do relatively well and that I do better at, in terms of like how I interact with people. Think twice and speak once.
I think that goes for all of us. I think that's probably a good place to stop, because if I don't stop, I think Sophie's going to kill me.
Yeah.
So I better.
Right. It's been good to talk to you. I appreciate it.
No, it's been a pleasure talking to you. So I mean, we've been through Scientific American endorsing Joe Biden. We've been through SCOTUS. We've been through Trump saying he won't leave office. We've been through Venus. We've been through white dwarfs. We've been through a ton, and it's been fun. So if you're interested in any of those topics, have a relook over the live stream. Thank you for everyone who's sort of stopped by in my stream.
So why don't you share your digits with the people that are online over here?
Oh yes. So if you want to pop by, I'm going to basically be doing a big push towards Christmas on the live stuff, streaming to YouTube. Just over at Bad Boy of Science. So my background is a professor. I'm bigging myself up a little bit.
There you go.
Yeah, exactly. Doctor of particle physics, formerly of the Large Hadron Collider, Cambridge University. But I love discussing anything science, anything politics, where we can discuss it with logic, reason, try and break things down, try and get to the truth of the stuff. If you're interested in that sort of stuff, pop over here. And likewise, your stream where you do a similar thing, where can people go and find that?
So I try to steer as much of my content as possible towards science. So I do some history stuff, So Horizon Sci is my Twitch handle. I stream twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays now, but it changes every semester with the new teaching schedule. And most of the stuff I do is science. I'm an amateur history. I'm an armchair historian. I like to do history stuff as well. I do like talking about science policy and stuff like that. I don't like partisanship, and to some extent, I feel like I get forced into it somehow just because of the nature of being in a place where most people lean one direction.
It's because I force you to talk about political stuff. That's why.
No, well, I mean, it comes out, but like I recognize it's the world we kind of live in.
Yeah.
But I try, and I have redoubled my desire to focus most of my stuff on science content. Even over the last week and a half, I was like, I really want to make sure that I talk science a lot on my stream. So we're doing astronomy right now. We'll probably go into some really kind of fundamental physics around the end of the semester. So it's pretty good. So what platforms are you on, and what's your handle? So my handle is Horizon Sci. Horizon was the name of my computer when I was in graduate school. And so Horizon Sci is my handle on Twitter and on Twitch.
Yeah, and mine's Bad Boy of Science on YouTube, and then Samuel_Gregson on Twitter, because Sam Gregson was taken apparently. So if you want to head over there, please do. You're very, very welcome.
All right. Hey, thanks a lot. We will talk. We'll talk again. So what we should do is maybe over the next few weeks before we do this again is assemble a list of science headlines. Let's see if we can, like, how much.
Keep it all on science next time.
It may be a challenge because we're looking at, a month from now we'd be staring at the face of the election.
Yeah.
So there's going to be other stuff I'm sure that comes up. So maybe we can't avoid it. Depends on when we talk next, but and then it's going to be. Is everyone looking forward to February of 2021? But we'll definitely assemble some science headlines that come out, because there's always good ones that come up, and it'll give us a chance to kind of go into details about some of those things.
Sounds good, dude.
All right. Hey, thanks a lot.
All right, good stuff. Thanks for everyone for stopping by, both on your stream and my stream. And let's chat again soon.
All right, sounds good.
All right, buddy. Take it easy.
Bye.
Peace.